Forbidden places you will never visit. Just imagine you're on a fishing boat in the Bay of Bengal. You've had a successful day and it's time to get back to shore, when all of a sudden a typhoon forms right in front of your face over the water. And before you know it, your boat has been flipped and you are essentially lost at sea. Your entire crew is gone and you're holding onto a floating board for dear life. Your energy is low from kicking and screaming, and you pass out, clinging to this board. You wake up later, looking at a clear sky, and you notice you're not in the water anymore. You're on the beach, but you don't know what beach you're at because you weren't near land. You cough up some water and start to sit up when you realize a small bunch of blobs in the distance. You see them approach and you realize that it's people, but not people you've seen before. The closer you get, the more you realize that these people are barely clothed and wielding sticks and bows. Did you time travel? Unfortunately not. You have just washed up on North Sentinel Island. North Sentinel Island is the first location on this list, and it is likely one of the most well-known forbidden places in the entire world. Oh, and as far as the fisherman who washed up on the beach, yeah, his skull is now a pendant for one of the Sentinelese people. North Sentinel Island is one of the Andaman Islands in the Indian archipelago in the Bay of Bengal, which also includes some other smaller islands as well. What makes North Sentinel Island so unique is the fact that it's solely occupied by a voluntarily isolated indigenous tribe, who are believed to have been there for over 60,000 years. These people are known as the Sentinelese, and they have made their wishes known by force, specifically by killing anybody who tries to contact them or even come close. They have made their message so clear that the Indian Navy patrols the area around the North Sentinel Island to protect it from people trying to enter it. And the Indian government does not prosecute any Sentinelese people for killing people that try to step ashore. That's insane that this uncontacted tribe is essentially immune to the law. The Sentinelese have not only attacked people that have stepped on shore, but have also repeatedly attacked approaching vessels, whether those be fishing boats or simply any sort of low-flying helicopter or plane in the range of their bows and arrows. The story I told at the beginning of this segment is actually inspired by real events that took place in 2006. During this time, Sentinelese islanders killed 2 fishermen whose boat drifted ashore. And like the intro story, this approach wasn't even intentional. Although, speaking of intentionally visiting the Sentinelese, in 2018, a 26-year-old man named John Chu, who was an American Christian missionary, tried on 3 separate attempts to visit the North Sentinelese people, likely to convert them to Christianity, but unfortunately on his 3rd trip, which he was successfully able to approach these people, he was unsurprisingly murdered, which is obviously unfortunate. But this young man was warned by the Indian government and other authorities. In 1956, there was an Islands Protection of Aboriginal Tribes regulation that was put in place that restricted any approach closer than 5 nautical miles, which is essentially anywhere within a 10-kilometer radius of the island. The biggest reason why this regulation was put in place is to protect the Sentinelese people from mainland diseases. Due to the severity of the isolation of North Sentinel Island, they have almost no immunity to any modern-day disease or germ that may be on you or I right now. So if you were to visit North Sentinel Island, there's a very likely chance that even spending time around them, breathing near them, shaking one of their hands, could lead to the death of the entire population of the Sentinelese people simply by spreading germs. North Sentinel Island is a forbidden location that I personally don't intend on breaking any rules to visit. But what if fishing wasn't your speed? Perhaps you are more interested in agriculture, specifically Chinese agriculture. The year is 1974, and you are simply on your farm. And what's a good farm without a well? So, you start digging a well. However, this day was different. As you start digging, you notice something that is about to uncover one of the largest excavation projects of all time. And then you go deeper and you notice hardened fragments of terracotta. And then you notice bronze arrowheads. And then terracotta bricks. Well, in that case, you just discovered the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first Qin emperor of China. These artifacts were submitted to the government, and shortly after, archaeologists arrived. And although they were curious and interested about the artifacts that may have laid underground, they were not at all prepared for what they were about to find. What they found was a massive necropolis, the size of a small city, with a plethora of artifacts, weapons, vehicles, and most famously, terracotta soldiers. There is estimated to be over 8,000 terracotta soldiers in total, but that actual figure is unknown because this mausoleum is still not fully excavated and may never be. Keep in mind, this excavation has been going on since 1974 and still continues to this day. This mausoleum was built from 246 to 208 BC. The mausoleum mirrored the city of Jianyang with an inner and outer city structure. And although this outer and inner city structure where the terracotta soldiers have been found has began to be excavated, one place that has never been touched was the tomb itself. This tomb is at the very center of the complex, and it is very large. In case the thousands of terracotta soldiers were not enough of a sign, the late Qin Shi Huang did not want people entering his tomb. At least, not without a fight, I guess. So I suppose that begs the question, why did the government keep excavating? Well, the three reasons they listed publicly were the following. One was the fact that this area was a seismic zone, and they needed to remove these historic artifacts to protect them. The next reason was for tourism, to potentially make it something that people could visit and appreciate. And the third reason was to prevent grave robbing, essentially theorizing that if they didn't take it, somebody else would. In case the 8,000 terracotta soldiers didn't make this obvious, this mausoleum is massive. The replica inner city is over 2.5 kilometers in circumference, and the outer city is over 6.3 kilometers in circumference, which is insane for a mausoleum. Even the tomb itself is massive. It's believed to be 80 meters east to west and 50 meters north to south, and 15 meters tall on the inside. However, the interior height is debated. It is a very real possibility that we will never be able to know what's inside the tomb, simply because of limitations in archaeological abilities, specifically the risk of destroying so many other artifacts just to get inside the tomb. But we do have historical accounts of what is said to be inside the tomb, which is the following. The emperor's tomb is surrounded by rivers of liquid mercury, which was the emperor's immortality elixir of choice. Which, just quick side note, yeah, this emperor was literally drinking mercury to try to extend his life, which ironically ended up causing him to go crazy and die. But okay, back to the historical account. There is a domed ceiling representing celestial bodies made from pearls and precious gems. The floor has a design of the entire map of his empire. And besides all of his precious belongings and stunning architecture, there was of course claims of booby traps, specifically crossbow traps that would be activated if anybody tried to enter the tomb, which would result in them, of course, being shot and killed. Here's where things get interesting. These accounts were of course questionable, and archaeologists were suspicious. But after probing the soil near the tomb, it was confirmed that the mercury levels in the soil were 100 times over the normal level, giving some credibility to these historic claims. Which also gives credibility to the fact that there may be booby traps, which has essentially spooked archaeologists, as they believe these traps would be fully functioning, which I personally find hard to believe, but I also wouldn't risk it either. This tomb is listed as a World Heritage Site and is therefore protected by legal entities. But that's not the only reason why you're not able to go here. Unlike North Sentinel Island, which is relatively easy to visit if you have a boat or know somebody with a boat, the tomb of Qin Shi Huang is simply unable to be reached, at least to any regular person with reasonable means. What I mean is, of course, if you hypothetically had a bunch of dynamite, you could blow it up, but obviously that's not realistic. Or is it? No. Unless... Just kidding. Therefore, you're not only not allowed to visit it, you're also not able, making it a perfect entry for this list. Let's hope that you got your sea legs back, because we're hitting the water again. This time, we're going to a remote island intentionally, although it's not off the coast of India. This island is actually in the Arctic Circle. This island is known as Spitsbergen, and it's tucked away in the Arctic Svalbard archipelago. And if you're wondering why we're going here, it's primarily because of your passion for agriculture. Spitsbergen is the home of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, and this seed vault is one of the most interesting places in the entire world, and is kind of an interesting take on the Doomsday Vault. In short, it's an ultra-secure facility with the sole purpose of being a safeguard for global crop diversity by storing duplicates of every known seed. This place is really just a sperm bank for plants, or other stuff like that. The Seed Vault is actually a partnership between the Norwegian government and Crop Trust, which is a genetic resource center, which sounds evil, but probably isn't. But it might be. This facility is epic, and if you like brutalist architecture, you are going to love this building. It's essentially a concrete slab sticking out the side of a mountain in the middle of an uninhabited Arctic wasteland. To me, it seems like a pretty cool place to store some stuff. The entire facility goes almost 400 feet into the side of a mountain, and a majority of this facility is kept at negative 18 degrees Celsius, as that is the recommended temperature to store seeds. I guess, I don't know, I'm not a seed expert. One unique failsafe about this facility that I think is pretty cool is the fact that even if all the refrigeration units failed today, the seed vault would still be completely protected because it is stored within permafrost, meaning that it's very well insulated and very cold. Now, if only the people that designed this designed the Death Star too. As of 2022, there is over 1.2 million unique types of seed in this facility. And interestingly, and potentially somewhat obviously, this facility is not manned. It is autonomous, and I suppose that's a good thing considering the fact that it's literally in the middle of nowhere, always kept at deadly temperatures with basically nothing around you. This seed bank is a really unique modern invention that I think serves a genuine purpose that hopefully we will never need, but could very well serve a massive role in the development of humanity if it ever came to it. I think it goes without saying that this seed vault is completely off limits. Not only is it in an extremely remote location in a part of the world that's already hard to navigate and travel to, but the facility itself is extremely secure. So unfortunately, you won't be able to check out the cool seed collection, but that's okay. And you're a person of culture. Modern archives and architecture is cool, but you want history. You want to see some cool stuff and some old stuff. And for that exact reason, we're going to France. The date is September 12th, 1940, and you and your trusty dog are on a walk like any other day. Your dog notices a hole left by an uprooted tree, and you notice something rather interesting, but you don't bother at the moment. You go home and ponder on what you may have saw and decide that you have some unfinished business, and you return to that uprooted tree with 3 of your best friends. You begin digging, a common theme in this video, I suppose, and notice that this uprooted tree has a lot below it. Specifically, a 15-meter deep cave shaft. You and your friends are brave, and you enter the cave and start exploring. And not only do you see some cool stalactites and stalagmites and light brights, but you also see interesting designs on the walls. Those designs were ancient cave paintings depicting animals. This cave is known as Lascaux Cave, and it is a network of caves in southwestern France with over 600 cave paintings found on the interior walls of its caves. It is suggested that these paintings were not made all at once and that they were the combined effort of many generations. And although they haven't been able to quite pinpoint a date for each and every one of these paintings, the general consensus is that these paintings are anywhere from 17 to 22,000 years old, which is so cool. There was an amount of time where this cave was actually open to the public for tours, but over time, due to carbon dioxide, heat, humidity, and other contaminants produced by the 1,200 visitors that visited these caves a day, the paintings were essentially disintegrating and were being visibly damaged. Therefore, the cave was closed to the public in 1963. Since then, the paintings have been restored to their original state and a monitoring system has been put in place. It's actually just a baguette holding a door closed. I don't know, I'm sure they've got something amazing. So yeah, unless you're able to travel at least 70 years into the past, you're not going to be seeing these original 22,000-year-old paintings. However, this story does have a bit of a happy ending, because obviously there was demand for these cave tours, and that wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. So what the authorities actually did was create exact replicas of this cave system for people to explore and visit without any risk of the originals being damaged, which is honestly pretty cool. But what isn't cool is snakes. And since 2 out of the 4 entries on this list so far have been on islands, let's add another one to the list and combine the 2. Snakes in an island. You know what that gets you? You're right. Snake Island. No, not the island boy's haircut. Snake Island is an island, I know. And it is also off the coast of Brazil. The island is famous for, of course, its large population of venomous snakes, specifically the golden lancehead pit viper. And what's interesting is that this island is the only known natural home for this breed of snakes. But there is a bit of mystery surrounding this island. How exactly did these snakes get here, and why is there so many of them? It's not called Snake Island because there's a few. It's called Snake Island because it's only inhabited by snakes, and a lot of them at that. The island is roughly 106 acres in area, and is believed to be the home of around 400,000 snakes, although that number more recently has been debated. But if you ask me, I don't think we're getting an accurate head count anytime soon. Point being, there is a lot of snakes on this island. But the question remains, how did these snakes get here? And I hope you brought your tissues because it's kind of a sad story. Basically, when the Portuguese colonized Brazil, the Portuguese made all of the native Brazilians disown their pet snakes. Obviously, outraged, the native Brazilians didn't give up their snakes without a fight, and they banded up all of their snakes and sent them off to sea on a raft, hoping that they would find a better life. After a few days, this raft of about 500,000 snakes washed up ashore on this uninhabited island, and the rest is history. I totally just made all of that up. The real reason why there is so many snakes on this island is much more simple. During the last ice age, this island, which is now 33 kilometers off the coast of Brazil, was actually connected to the mainland. But near the end of the ice age, as water levels started to rise, the snakes essentially became trapped on this island. Their population grew due to a lack of natural predators. Fortunately, these snakes weren't the only animals on the island. There was actually a plethora of ladders. But unfortunately, after a few dangerous games of snakes and ladders, only the snakes remained. I don't know why I'm lying so much in this video, but hopefully you can tell fact from fiction. Sure, there's a lot of snakes on an island, but there's a lot of snakes on a plane too, and people are still on the plane. Why is there not people on this island? Well, similar to North Sentinel Island, Snake Island is off limits to any civilians. The Brazilian Navy claims that this is for the protection of both the snakes and the people that may potentially try to access the island. The only people that are advised to go on the island have to be vetted by the Institute for Biodiversity Conservation, which I'm assuming is no easy task. And if you try to go the other way, well, you'll have to deal with the Brazilian Navy. And similar to North Sentinel Island, if the snakes kill you, the Brazilian Navy is not going to put them in jail. That's crazy that now twice on this list, there is groups of people that are immune to the law simply because they got an island. I wonder if there's any more recent examples of people with islands breaking the law. That's an interesting phenomenon, but let's keep moving. Wait, okay, last thing I'm gonna say about Snake Island. Making fake maps claiming that there is buried treasure on this remote island, when in reality, it's actually just Snake Island, would be a hilarious prank. Not in the modern day, but definitely pirate times, dude. This was a pirate time banger of a prank, guaranteed. You know what? We're on the topic of islands. Last island, one last island for the list. Palette cleanse, we'll go through it quick. Morgan Island. No story, no nothing. Just straight up facts. Morgan Island is also known as Monkey Island, and if you can't guess why it's called that, you may live on Monkey Island. Monkey Island is famous for, of course, its population of free-ranged monkeys. It is completely uninhabited by people, and this island is protected by the Department of Natural Resources and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which use it for public health research, which unfortunately is basically just animal testing. Boo. Monkey Island, unlike Snake Island, is not naturally occurring, and actually has a very odd origin story. To put it bluntly, there was a lot of monkeys in Puerto Rico that were carrying hepatitis B, and it was becoming so much of a problem that there was frequent outbreaks. So what is the most logical and reasonable next step? Well, according to some people in 1979, the best idea was to capture 1,400 monkeys and relocate them to a remote island in South Carolina. And ladies and gentlemen, Morgan Island, aka Monkey Island. So in case you ever wanted to be surrounded by over 1,000 monkeys with hepatitis, Morgan Island definitely needs to be on your travel wish list. But you don't just want to go to remote islands full of uncontacted tribes or a plethora of dangerous animals. And you don't want to go to rural China. And you don't like the cold, so Norway's out too. Well, if that's the case, then I have one last location for you. And if you're a Reddit meme lord, then you're going to be right at home. This last forbidden location takes us to a salt flat in the middle of Nevada. The salt flat is known as Groom Lake. And what makes this salt flat relevant to this video is what's built on the salt flat. That being a Nevada test and training range. But there's military bases everywhere, so what makes this one so special? This test and training range is home to one of the most popular and highly classified United States Air Force bases, most commonly known as Area 51. Interestingly, Area 51 was never considered a secret base. However, it is the home for some of the most secret and sensitive documents that pertain to military intel in the United States. The origin of the name Area 51 is actually unknown. However, according to the CIA, the proper names for the facility are Homey Airport and Groom Lake. The primary initial purpose of Area 51 was a testing ground for Project Aquatone, the development of the Lockheed U-2, which was one of the most iconic spy planes of all time, and still has a lot of mystery surrounding it, almost 70 years later. Since then, this area has gained a lot more popularity, and due to the secrecy surrounding it, there has been no shortage of questions, mysteries, and conspiracy theories surrounding the happenings of this military base. Obviously, with the most famous examples being its affiliation with aliens. I honestly wish I had more to talk about, but facts about this location are kind of hard to come by, and I don't think I need to explain why a military base with sensitive information is off limits. But I do find it kind of interesting that, although this is a perfect entry for this video, it's a bit of a catch-22. Because for any random civilian, Area 51 is a place you will never even get close to. At least, not alive. But for hundreds of people, this is a place they come every single day. It's their job. But that's a different story. In 2019, there was actually a large movement for people with way too much free time to storm Area 51 to get answers and see an alien for themselves. This movement was heavily meme-based, but was still very real. On the night of the actual event, over 1,500 people showed up at the border of Area 51, primarily partying and enjoying the scenery, although some took it more serious than others. At the end of the event, nobody got in. Surprisingly, nobody died, and 7 people were arrested. It was a mostly peaceful meme, but I'm sure when all of this was gaining traction and popularity online, some government employees were definitely starting to sweat a bit. Common scams everyone still falls for. The printer ink plot. Let me know if this sounds familiar. It's back to school season and you need a printer. You've got homework, projects, and lots of things that you need to print out, and for that reason, you're going to BroBuy to buy a printer. Luckily for you, there is tons of back-to-school sales, and you find the perfect printer for you for only $50. This printer looks solid, comes from a reputable brand, and even comes with ink. And although it was originally $100, for you, today it's $50. You buy this printer from BroBuy, you go back to your dorm room, and as the school semester begins, you realize your ink begins to get low. Obviously, ink is a consumable item, so you understand you have to replace it eventually, but this seems a bit quick. Regardless, you go back to BroBuy and begin to find the perfect ink replacement. Now, the first thing that's not really a scam, but is definitely irritating, is the crazy naming structure of ink cartridges. Like, if you somehow forgot to bring the Rosetta Stone to the printer ink section of BroBuy, you're gonna go home empty-handed or with ink that's not gonna fit your printer. Regardless, assuming you know exactly what you're looking for, you find this printer ink was not so much of a deal. The printer you bought only a month ago was $50, but this printer ink is $55. Obviously, this has to be a mistake, and you go to ask the employee if this is right, and they tell you, yeah, printer ink is expensive, it's hard to manufacture, blah, 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 blah. And you, being clever, decide that, well, if the ink is more, I'm just gonna buy another printer. But you go to the printer section only to realize that the printer is no longer on sale. And your options now are a $100 full price printer or $55 ink. And you take the $55 ink cartridge to the cash register, you check out, and you head home. If this sounds even remotely familiar to you, then I'm sorry to tell you, you have been scammed. Considering it's 2025, I would definitely say that most people are privy to the fact that printer ink cartridges are a scam. However, I would argue that most people are still oblivious to the fact of exactly how deep this scam runs, which is why this entry is on this list, and I'm going to expose the scam even further. To lay the foundation, the general business model of ink cartridge printers essentially goes like this. These companies produce a relatively quality printer, typically selling them with very thin margins or even sometimes at a loss, knowing that the real money is going to be made on the back end with their ink. And they ensure this back end business in multiple ways. The first method that these brands use is creating a proprietary ink cartridge that only works with their printers. This ensures that the consumer is not buying ink from other big brands or even smaller third parties that could give a better deal, meaning that the person who bought the cheap printer is now locked into their overpriced ink. But of course, it doesn't stop there. So now that we have a basic understanding of the bait and switch tactics that printer companies use to sell cheap printers but expensive ink, how else are they actually scamming you? Well, for starters, the cartridges that you are buying are basically empty. There are tons of videos online of people cracking open these ink cartridges only for them to be filled with foam and drops of ink, literally drops. According to some of the YouTube videos I saw, these ink cartridges claimed to have 11 milliliters of ink, but actually only contained 3 milliliters of usable ink, which is ridiculous if you keep in mind the fact that you're paying anywhere from $10 to $50 for this ink. Those are some pretty expensive milliliters. Not only are these printer companies forcing you to buy their cartridges and forcing you to pay egregious prices for minimal ink, these printers are also wasting this precious ink that you spent your hard-earned money on. No, literally, let's say that you want to print a full-page document in just black. Regardless of what you choose, your printer is still going to use black and color ink just because. Now, some people claim that the reason that printers do this is to ensure that your black is as vibrant and as rich as it could be. However, a YouTuber by the name of Fstoppers tested this, and he printed out a document in black, and then he printed another document in black, but he covered the tip of the color cartridge to see if there was a difference. And what he was able to confirm was both documents looked the exact same, meaning that the colored ink with the black ink made no difference in the final product, meaning that the printer is literally wasting your colored ink even on fully black prints. So while the printer companies say they're just enhancing your black with a little bit of blue or a little bit of pink, the reality is you cannot say no to this option and use only your black ink. And if you can't even say no to this function, to me, that's a scam. But once again, it doesn't end there. Not only are printers wasting your ink by adding colors you don't need to black prints, most cartridge printers go through something known as a cleaning cycle. And these typically occur either every time the printer is turned on or every time the printer prints something. And at a surface level, this makes sense. A printer is using a very fine tip to deliver a very precise amount of ink on a paper without having it bleed or smear. So for that reason, having a clean printer ink tip makes sense. However, this cleaning cycle is extremely wasteful. And not only does it just clean the tip of the cartridge, but in some cases, this cleaning cycle causes ink to come out of the cartridge, and over time typically results in half of the ink cartridge being wasted just on this cleaning cycle. You can't tell me that's not at least a bit intentional, or at least hasn't been fixed for a reason. Oh, and don't even get me started on trying to refill these cartridges because, well, first of all, you literally can't even open them, and if you try to, there's an extremely high chance that your printer will just reject the tampered with cartridge to begin with. I've been talking about printers way too much, and we have a lot of ground to cover in this video. Oh, don't even get me started on the environmental aspect of all of the wasted cartridges and all of the toxic ink. That's a whole different disaster. The diamond disaster. Similar to the ink cartridge scam, I think that in this day and age, most people are privy to the fact that diamonds are not as rare as they say, and the market is for the most part propped up by manipulation and lies. And while I could make an entire video about the sheer depravity of the diamond industry, covering topics like forced child labor and market manipulation, however, for the purpose of this video, I'm gonna focus on one specific subset of the diamond industry, the diamond engagement ring scam. Imagine you're on the beach with the love of your life. You're both looking at the sunset when you realize that it's time to pop the question. You hold your soon-to-be fiance's hand, get down on one knee, and present her with a small, tiny box. Inside of that tiny box is a diamond wedding ring that costs twice your monthly salary. And you're just praying that she loves it. Your soon-to-be fiance looks down at the ring and then looks at you only to say yes. This, for most people, is one of the happiest days of their life. However, it's ironic because this is one of the biggest scams that most people fall for. And no, I'm not saying anything about the institution of marriage, but have you ever questioned why we propose with diamond engagement rings? Or think of what would have happened if you proposed without a diamond ring, or at least a ring that resembled a diamond? And while I can't answer that second question for you, I can definitely answer the first. And the short answer is marketing. That's right, the entire diamond engagement ring tradition actually took place because of an advertising campaign. During the late 1800s, diamonds were not rare at all, and huge diamond mines were discovered all across South Africa. And as a result, the market was flooded with many huge raw diamonds, essentially collapsing the entire diamond market. This was obviously detrimental for jewelers and anybody mining, processing, and selling raw diamonds, which is why the mining company De Beers had to think fast and change the trajectory of the diamond market forever. And that they did. Prior to the 1930s, when you proposed to somebody, a diamond ring was not a requirement whatsoever. It wasn't even a consideration. However, that all began to change in the late 1930s with one of De Beers' many marketing campaigns. At this time, De Beers was actively bombarding the public with messaging along the lines of, hey, the only way to prove your love to your soon-to-be fiance is by giving her a valuable diamond ring. And in 1938, De Beers even coined the term, a diamond is forever, insinuating giving somebody a diamond ring at your proposal ensures everlasting love. Not only did De Beers plan a hostile takeover of the average American engagement, but they also planned a hostile takeover over your bank account. Because not only did they want you to buy a diamond ring for your engagement, but they also convinced you that the only acceptable ring was equivalent to 2 months of your take-home salary, which is once again insane and egregious. However, people bought it up, and this myth is still perpetuated to this day. But all isn't lost, right? Because even if you fall for this scam, at least diamonds have some sort of market and value, right? While that may be true in some cases, you are never going to get the value back you paid for your ring. And ironically enough, in 1999, the De Beers chairman, Nicky Oppenheimer, said, quote, diamonds are intrinsically worthless. Basically laughing in the face of everybody that De Beers manipulated over the last almost 100 years. So yeah, De Beers specifically made you feel obligated to buy a diamond ring with your proposal, made you feel worthless if you didn't spend way more than you could afford on it, and also made you feel stupid if you ever tried to sell it and realized that it's actually worth nowhere near what you paid for it. Which makes me think that the whole diamond is forever thing was basically just a slogan ensuring that people never resold their diamonds. But that's just a theory. Regardless, it's kind of just sad that a tradition that is so ingrained within our society is actually based in manipulation and lies. Oh, and if you watched our video a few weeks ago about the craziest conspiracies part 4, then you might remember me talking about the crazy cigarette advertisements of the 1930s that also changed the world. You know, the advertisements that literally had pregnant mothers and doctors promoting cigarettes? Yeah, the advertisements of the 1930s need to be studied because they had such a detrimental impact on society. But that's beyond the scope of this video. Let's keep moving. Textbook trickery. Picture this. You are in the kitchen looking at your laptop with your family all anxiously waiting around you. You have just received an email response from your dream college either accepting or denying your application. And this moment feels like it could be make or break. Reluctantly, you click on the email without even looking, and slowly you unsquint your eyes only to hear your parents scream and to see the email say, accepted. This is such an exciting moment and milestone that should be celebrated. A few months goes by and the beginning of the school semester starts. You go to the college orientation and you are given a list of books you need to buy for your courses for this semester. Awesome. You decide to go to the school bookstore only to realize that these textbooks were more money than you've ever spent in your entire life. For a lot of students, this is not only disheartening, but extremely detrimental. Because if you've just paid out of pocket or got into thousands and thousands of dollars of debt to go into school, only to then need to pay thousands more in textbooks, you could be putting yourself in a very bad spot. And if you're in school, your capacity to work is already low, meaning that you're setting yourself up not for the future you thought you had, but for a lifetime of debt. If you currently are or were a student within the last 20 years, then you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that college textbooks are literally a scam. Obviously, college textbooks are extremely expensive, but the scam goes far beyond that. In 2010, the average college student in America spent $1,200 per year on textbooks and school supplies, with the majority of that being textbooks. Similar to buying a diamond engagement ring, buying expensive textbooks seems like this is something that people have always done, but that's actually not the case. Over the last 30 years, college textbook prices have increased by 800%. And this gross exponential growth in textbook price doesn't only have an effect on the student's wallet, but also on their education. Because as of 2016, almost 65% of college students in America opted out of buying textbooks because they were too expensive. As they should, although not having the most up-to-date textbooks does directly have an impact on their ability to learn, affecting their education, the whole reason they're in school in the first place. And the textbook companies not only know this, but actually go the extra mile to ensure that the older textbooks not only have less value, but are also less helpful. Let me explain. Most college or university textbooks have a new edition every single year, and today typically include some sort of bonus content only accessible with the newest book. But this access code can only be used once, and typically the content that you are accessing you will only have for a certain amount of time. Some universities require you to buy a brand new textbook so that you can access this code to do extracurricular homework or to do additional tasks, meaning that colleges are not only complicit, but actually an active participant in the scam as well. Because in most cases, colleges get a commission from these hyperinflated textbook prices. And if you compare a previous edition to the most recent edition, there is typically little to no changes in terms of content within the textbook. However, there is one major change you will notice, and that is the order of the information. And the reason why this is one, so the textbook seems different because things are in different orders, but also primarily so that the textbook of the previous year is not usable to current students. Imagine if you're in a class and everybody else has the new textbook, but you have the old textbook. If you're asking somebody for help and they say, oh, flip to page 45, but your 45 isn't their 45, your experience is already dwindled because you didn't spend the money in a new book. That is an intentional scam that directly affects your learning experience. And if you're a company that literally sells textbooks, I have no idea how you can justify this practice at all. To me, this is insanely predatory and just upsetting. Don't be complicit in the scam. Inform your friends and also do what's best for your interest and your budget. These college textbook companies make enough money. Get a used copy, or if you find one online, well, I won't tell anybody. The diet pill debacle. The health and supplement industry is riddled with scams, and that topic is an entirely separate video on its own. But the supplements I want to focus on specifically are diet pills. Diet pills generally are any supplement that claim that they can help you lose fat or burn calories simply by taking the pill and doing nothing else. These supplements are largely cash grabs that prey upon insecure people, and it's truly upsetting. Most diet pills rely on deceptive marketing, white lies, and half-truths to even be able to make any sort of claim, and that's why I wanted to call them out and expose a lot of the scammery associated with diet pills specifically. If you're a bro that's ever had a little bit of flub on your chub and you just wished you could kind of get rid of it with the snap of your fingers, then you would have been the prime target for one of these diet pill companies. Because the entire dream that these diet pill companies sell is that they can help you take all of your insecurities and literally excess body fat away if you buy their product and, well, give them money. But the reality is that over-the-counter supplements are not able to help make this change. They do nothing at all. Diet pills, also known as fat burners in the fitness industry, typically contain one of two ingredients. The first ingredient is some sort of caffeine-based stimulant, and they may, in addition or potentially separately, also contain an unregulated herbal blend, both with the same goal of either suppressing your appetite or boosting your metabolism. Already, you might have noticed a massive issue with the whole unregulated herbal blend, and that's because this blend is being curated and sold by companies that truly do not care about the consumer because their entire business relies on scamming the consumer. Because nobody in the supplement or fitness industry really believes in any sort of fat-burning supplement. It just doesn't work, or at the very least, not in the way that they say it does. Regardless, these stimulant mixes and herbal blends are only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to these fat burners, because assuming that they're at least safe, which they are in most cases, you're still being scammed, but at least you're not being scammed and poisoned. Now, the appetite suppression or potential metabolism boost you may find from these fat burners is negligible and doesn't cause a noticeable result at all in most individuals. What people who do take fat burners typically experience is a slightly reduced appetite and potentially a placebo effect. But even if this reduced appetite is causing you to lose weight, the weight loss is extremely not only negligible but also unsustainable if it even happens at all, simply because you're not addressing the core issue at play, which is typically your caloric intake and the amount of exercise you get on a daily basis. But besides the fact that the effects are either unsustainable or non-existent, these blends are not without their side effects. And common side effects from these fat burners include insomnia, anxiety, high blood pressure, and even digestive issue because of the massive amount of stimulants. Also, in combination with these herbal blends that your body may have never interacted with and may have an interesting reaction with. So already we're off to a rough start because the blends that they're using are questionable, and the results are actually, well, also once again questionable. But I think the nail in the coffin for fat burners or diet pills is definitely the deceptive marketing and business strategies that drive the entire industry. Roughly 95 to 99% of the entire fat burning supplement industry use ridiculous before and after photos and have insane claims that are not backed by science whatsoever. And in the United States, the National Institute of Health has even stated that very few dietary supplements that have been marketed for weight loss have been proven to be effective at all. And what is more reported with fat burning and weight loss pills is not weight loss, but actually serious health complications, typically liver damage and heart problems. Two things often associated with unregulated herbal blends and caffeine abuse. And I know a lot of you might be thinking, wow, this guy talks really fast, he must drink a lot of caffeine himself. And truthfully, I don't do caffeine because this is me normally, and I couldn't imagine myself on caffeine. And I know you definitely wouldn't like it either. But predatory marketing and questionable ingredients aside, one of the biggest issues with the whole diet pill fat burning supplement industry is the fact that they rely on legal loopholes to keep their products on shelves. These companies know that they're selling scams, and these companies are doing everything they can to be just within the lines to still be technically legal. In a lot of cases, companies that are selling these fat burning pills are typically either rebranding or tweaking existing formulas depending on whether or not they've been banned by the FDA yet. If there is an existing fat burning blend, then companies can simply white label that product, slap their name on it, and sell it. However, if the FDA bans one of the ingredients in this formula, then all they need to do is simply swap that one ingredient and start a new brand that hasn't had their reputation tainted by the fact that they used banned ingredients by the FDA. One of the biggest loopholes that these supplement companies use is the actual term supplement. While these fat burners and diet pills have claims that would be reminiscent of a pharmaceutical drug or potentially something like a GLP-1 medication, these drugs are technically classified as a supplement, meaning that they have not gone through the rigorous testing and scrutiny that pharmaceutical drugs do. Now, that by itself doesn't mean that pharmaceutical drugs are off the hook. That's an entirely separate can of worms, but focusing on these supplements specifically, they leverage the fact that supplements have a lower bar when it comes to testing and a lower barrier of entry when it comes to getting into the market. Now, you might be asking yourself, how are diet pills and fat burners still selling in 2025 if they've been sold over the last, 20, 30, 40 years and they have been proven to not be effective? And the reason is, a sucker is born every day. Unfortunately, there's always going to be people that are unhappy with their self-image and struggling and looking for any sort of way to feel better or potentially make progress. And that's where these pills are able to take advantage of these people. And these brands know that, which is why they're remaining on shelves and still make sales in this day. And the whole weight loss, fat burning supplement industry is still a multi-billion-dollar business. These companies know that they're selling hopes and dreams in a bottle. And for that reason, I would consider them a scam. But if you're a bro who's considering buying some sort of weight loss supplement or fat burning pill, just understand that literally going on a 10 to 20 minute walk every day would be more effective and safer and cheaper than any fat burning supplement you could buy. Eat healthy food, get active, and enjoy your life. It's really that simple. Don't let companies tell you you're not enough or that you need their product to be worthy. Claw machine chaos. Before we get to the last entry in this list, if you guys have enjoyed this video about everyday scams you're probably still falling for, please feel free to let me know if you want a part 2 by either leaving a like or leaving a comment below. This video has been super fun to make, and unfortunately there is so many scams to cover. Regardless, let's talk about claw machines because I am still salty right now. Picture this. You go to your favorite arcade, convert $100 of real money into 40,000 fake tokens. You take your tokens and you go to the large claw machine, and in there you find the cutest stuffed animal ever. You decide you're going to play a few rounds, and you end up spending the next 20 minutes using all of your credits, basically $100 real, trying to get the stuffed animal worth maybe 20 that you did not get. This may or may not have been a real situation that happened to me recently, and for that reason, claw machines are scams. I'm half joking. They're not a scam because I lost. They are a scam because I lost and I researched it and I found out they're a scam. Basically, every machine that takes money for a prize has something known as an adjustable payout. And what an adjustable payout is basically a mechanism within the computer, within this device that you're playing on or gaming on, that determines whether or not you're going to win or lose a prize. Claw machines are not a skill game. They're literally just gambling machines. And for that reason, under US law, they are classified as amusement machines, the same classification that slot machines are under. And they all basically work the same way. Now, going back to adjustable payouts, basically every prize-based machine can only be won once a certain threshold of money has been earned. Let me break it down. Let's say that there's a claw machine that has a bunch of toys that are worth $1 in it. Let's say that the person who owns the claw machine is really greedy. And let's say that he sets the adjustable payout to every time the claw machine makes $100, the claw machine will then officially have the strength required to pick up one of the $1 prizes. In that case, every 99 children is going to be very upset that they wasted their dollar and didn't get a prize. However, that very lucky and random one person who actually gets a claw that has any sort of strength to it is going to get a prize, and, well, they're going to get their dollar back in the form of that toy. However, for 99% of people, that is not the case. And the game that seemingly relies on skill actually ends up being a game of chance. So yeah, if you've ever used a claw machine and wondered why the thing was just so limp and if it would ever win ever, well, it will win, just not when you're playing, or at least not likely. And the claw does have strength behind it, but it's only going to happen 1 out of 10, 20, 30, 50, 100, 1,000 times. And that's how claw machines and all gaming machines make money. They have items that are worth X amount of money, and they'll only let you win once they've made their return that they want to make. So if you ever see a machine with really expensive items in it, just realize that it's going to take a lot of money for that prize to ever be paid out. And while it's actually really fun to go to arcades and play with claw machines, understand that you're paying for the experience and the fun. And you are in no way, shape, or form ever going to make a return in any form of gambling. The richest people in human history. In the modern day, the position of world's richest person fluctuates pretty often, and these fluctuations are typically based off of stock price and other economic factors. And while it's interesting to talk about who the richest person in the modern day is, if you have an inquisitive mind, these thoughts may bring you to the question of who was the richest person in other time periods, and who was the richest person in human history. In this video, we're going to answer both of these questions and more, starting at the very beginning of human civilization, the Stone Age. It may serve as no surprise that because the Stone Age is, well, for the most part, prehistoric, we don't have any verifiable sources of wealthy individuals. That being said, that doesn't mean that we don't know what wealth looked like in the Stone Age, and for that reason, I wanted to at least quickly mention it. As I've mentioned in a few of our previous time period videos, wealth in the Stone Age was measured strictly in your ability to survive. And the things that granted your survival in the Stone Age were food, shelter, water, and community. And while those things may have no monetary value, in the Stone Age, being alive is a lot better than being dead with a pile of money. If you were rich in the Stone Age, you had a strong tribe around you. Your group consisted of strong, successful, ferocious hunters, attentive and expert gatherers, and passionate mothers taking care of the young. Humans in the Stone Age needed each other to survive, mainly because every aspect of life was work, and you can't do everything all by yourself. But in a tribe, tasks can be done by multiple people, allowing the group to survive. But outside of just tasks, the group also provided protection from natural predators, because in the Stone Age, humans weren't at the top of the food chain, and there was very much so natural predators that were wanting to eat you. But of course, community isn't the only thing that gave you wealth. Besides having this strong, tight-knit tribe, you also ensure that your tribe is located in a fruitful area of land. And what I mean by this is that hunting is bountiful. Animals consistently graze near your tribe, making hunting easy and consistent. But beyond just having a good location with consistent food and pelts, it's important that you have access to water, which is why you and your very wealthy tribe also have a perfectly clean stream going right beside your tribe's location. This stream provides your tribe not only with water, but also fish and transportation. But even with all of these Stone Age luxuries, there is still one more way that your tribe could have more wealth, and that is by having the best shelter possible. And in the Stone Age, one of the best options was a natural formation, typically a cave that provided shelter from storms and hot weather, consistent moderate temperatures, and once again, protection from natural predators. And while the bar may seem relatively low for the Stone Age, everything I just described was literally a dream come true. And if you happen to have all of these in your life, you were by far the wealthiest person to live. And by wealthiest, I just mean you were alive, because poverty in the Stone Age was literally just death. So even though our caveman ancestors didn't have much, and we can't verify who was the richest person at the time, it's at least interesting to understand what made a wealthy life during this time period, and it's also a good reminder that life is a blessing. The Bronze Age. No, not LeBron James, the Bronze Age, the time period that comes after the Stone Age. And luckily for us, we have verifiable evidence of who the richest person was during this time period. Wealth in the Bronze Age already looks worlds different than it did in the Stone Age. And that's because during the Bronze Age, human societal development really hit an exponential curve. And while the Stone Age literally went on for millions of years and only really yielded rudimentary structures and stone tools, the Bronze Age is where we really see society develop into small villages and also forging with metals. Most notably in this time period, bronze. With the development of society, culture, and tools, we now have a new definition of wealth. And fortunately, we also have documented history. However, I am using that term lightly because although we do have some texts referring to the reign and wealth of King Solomon, many of them came many years after his lifetime. So take some of these testimonies with a grain of salt. The year is 970 BC, and the kingdom of Israel is now under new management. King Solomon was the successor to his father, King David. It's estimated that King Solomon's rule ran from 970 BC to 931 BC. An impressive 39 years. And keep in mind, during this time period, even living to see 39 was an accomplishment. But longevity is not the point of this video, and what's even more impressive than his reign was his wealth. It's recorded that under the reign of King Solomon, his kingdom actually earned its highest splendor and wealth of all time, with record revenues reaching 666 talents of gold in a single year, which is an ironic number, but that equates to over 18,125 kilograms of gold earned in a single year. Keep in mind, the reason we're talking in precious metal volumes and not, well, dollar values is because during this time, money didn't even exist. Not even any form of coinage. Precious metals were truly the only store of value, meaning that gold was truly the gold standard. And for that reason, King Solomon got a lot of it. And how he got this gold may not be so much of a shock. As the king of a nation, Solomon's wealth primarily came through tax revenue. But on top of this massive tax revenue, he also earned money through trade alliances and also control over important trade routes that linked Africa, Asia, and Europe together. But like any good business mogul, he didn't end there. Solomon was also involved in mining, agriculture, and also building projects funded by the kingdom's resources itself, meaning that not only did he have a massive personal net worth, but he also had, well, basically infinite money at his expense through the wealth of the nation that he managed. And because of the prosperity that Solomon's kingdom saw during his long reign, it's estimated that King Solomon's net worth would be valued at anywhere from $2 to $3 trillion, which is insane. And since it's kind of variable, let's just average it at 2.5 trillion. Now, like I mentioned earlier, almost all of the information available about Solomon came from the Bible, which isn't an issue until you realize that Solomon lived and died hundreds of years before the Bible took place, essentially. So once again, for that reason, take this one with a grain of salt, but it's definitely an interesting first entry. And while we're on the topic of the Bible and interesting, not only did the Bible mention how wealthy King Solomon was, but they also mentioned how, well, promiscuous he was. And it's literally stated in the Bible that King Solomon had over 700 wives, and because that wasn't enough, he also had an additional 300 concubines, meaning that this dude literally not only had trillions of dollars, but also had 1,000 girls in his roster. The Iron Age. Interestingly, the Iron Age is not much different than the Bronze Age, and the brief period transitioning from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age was actually a pretty tumultuous time. And while that's kind of beyond the scope of this video, society essentially took 2 steps forward in the Bronze Age, and then 1 step back, and then 2 steps forward again into the Iron Age. And while once humanity sort of stabilized again within the Iron Age, it didn't look too different from the Bronze Age besides one key difference: the main metal at play, obviously being iron. But beyond the introduction of iron, we also see refinements and growth within the civilizations that were formed in the Bronze Age, or at least the ones that survived it. Consider that subtle foreshadowing. Now, once again, one of the richest people to ever exist, and most likely one of the richest people in all of the Iron Age, was a man known as King Croesus. And Croesus was the king of Lydia, a wealthy kingdom that existed in modern-day Turkey. Croesus had a relatively short reign, only reigning from 560 BC to 546 BC, roughly 14 years. But during this time, Croesus became an icon of wealth. And he was so rich, in fact, that the phrase, "as rich as Croesus," actually not only gained steam during his reign, but also existed for millennia after his death. But the story of Croesus and Lydia isn't all sunshine and rainbows, because although he did have immense wealth, his reign and life did eventually end up being cut short. But before we describe that, how exactly did he earn all this wealth? As a king, it may come as no surprise that Croesus's wealth was primarily earned through taxation, trade routes, and natural resources within the Kingdom of Lydia. Interestingly, in the Kingdom of Lydia, Lydia, there was literally a river that was full of something known as electrum, which was essentially a naturally occurring alloy of silver and gold, which is pretty fortunate. But not only was Croesus known for being rich, but he also changed money forever. He actually started minting some of the world's first coins ever, standardizing the world's first gold and silver coins. And he did this so he could A, centralize his wealth, and B, strengthen the economy of his entire kingdom. And his idea of forming precious metal coins took off and spread across, eventually, the entire world. But, as I mentioned, the story of Croesus is one of large wealth, but also one of large hubris. And it's claimed in ancient texts that it was the hubris of Croesus that led to his and his kingdom's eventual downfall. During Croesus's peak, the kingdom of Lydia was rich, expanding, and even had alliances with Greek city-states. And Croesus himself was synonymous with wealth and power. And it's believed that because of all of this success and power, Croesus got a bit too confident, and this confidence caused him to challenge Cyrus the Great of Persia, Persia being another opposing empire at the time. Croesus felt confident that he could expand his empire and take on Persia, but first he made sure to contact an oracle, and it's written that this oracle that Croesus consulted prophesied that, quote, Croesus would destroy a great empire. And it's believed that Croesus interpreted this message as he had already won the war, so he could begin it and win with ease. Although the opposite was true, and the empire that Croesus would destroy was actually his own. And in 546 BC, Lydia fell to Persia, and it's believed that Croesus was either executed or spared and turned into an advisor for Cyrus. At the peak of his net worth, it's estimated that Croesus had roughly a net worth of $500 billion. Which, I mean, compared to the previous trillionaire, doesn't sound that much, but this net worth is still insanely impressive. And remember, like King Solomon, this wealth was not stored in cash, stocks, crypto. This money was in physical gold and silver. And dude had so much money and so much time that he literally decided to create coinage. I bet King Solomon would have created coinage too if he wasn't messing around with 1,000 women. The classical era. The classical era is where things begin to get really interesting because history is getting more and more documented and wealth is becoming more and more, well, common. That being said, when I had to choose one rich person to represent the classical era, the option was obvious, and it started with me thinking about one of the most iconic empires that existed during the classical era, that being the Roman Empire. And when you think of Roman Empire, who do you think of? Julius Caesar wouldn't have been a wrong answer. But believe it or not, Julius Caesar wasn't actually the richest Roman. However, who is regarded as one of the richest, if not the richest Roman, was his adopted son, Augustus Caesar. And Augustus Caesar was getting that bag. Augustus Caesar was born in 63 BC. And after winning probably the biggest lottery in all of human history, he was adopted by Julius Caesar, the infamous dictator of Rome at the time. Augustus was brought up surrounded by wealth, power, influence, and strategy, and truly learned the ropes from one of the most iconic people to ever live. That being said, when Julius Caesar was assassinated, there was a massive power vacuum, and Augustus had some major shoes to fill. However, he did exactly that. And not only did he rise to power through political skill, but he also formed strategic alliances and had numerous military victories under his belt. And because of this, at the relatively young age of only 36, Augustus Caesar actually officially formed the Roman Empire. If you're a fan of the channel, then you know that we've talked about the Roman Empire at length through our almost 100 videos. And ironically, my second video ever was actually a video about why the Roman Empire fell. And while that's outside the scope of the video, I thought I would mention it, because the Roman Empire has way more lore than I can summarize right now. Let's focus back in on Augustus. Following suit with other kings and leaders we've discussed so far, Augustus accumulated his massive wealth through the major expansion of the Roman territory, massive conquests, and the spoils of war. On top of this, having one of the strongest empires allowed him to have a steady stream of taxation, provincial revenues, and even tributes from conquered land. And conquer land he did. Augustus' fortune was tied to the control of land across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, which obviously just was the Roman Empire, but it's crazy to think the sheer scale of this entire place that he controlled. And interestingly, historians estimate that in today's money, the net worth of Augustus would be in the trillions of dollars, likely in the 3 to 4 trillion range. But this is largely because as the emperor of the Roman Empire, he essentially controlled and owned everything within it. Like, just imagine you're working at an Amazon warehouse and Jeff Bezos walks in and just starts taking stuff off the shelves. I mean, nobody's gonna stop him, and technically it's his, but at the same time, it's also the company's, and the lines really start to get blurred. Regardless, Augustus Caesar had an insane career, both politically and economically. And for that reason, he's not only remembered as the founder of the Roman Empire, the son of Julius Caesar, but also as one of the richest men to ever live, with a net worth of, let's say, $3 trillion. The medieval era. History is really heating up with the medieval era, and we are once again getting more and more interesting entries to this list and more data to verify some of these claims. That being said, we are still in the realm of estimation. Although in the medieval era, we have some very interesting estimates to discuss. And I want to start our medieval journey not in medieval Europe, but actually in the steppes of Mongolia. In the year 1162, a young boy named Temujin was born, and little did his family know Temujin would become one of the most famous and prolific people to ever live. And while this boy was named Temujin, you likely know him better as Genghis Khan, the same Genghis Khan that founded the Mongol Empire, which was the largest contiguous land empire in all of human history. And the wealth of Genghis Khan is actually quite different from the others we've discussed so far, and the others that we're going to discuss as well. Quite frankly, being the founder and ruler of one of the largest empires to ever exist, there is a very likely chance that Genghis Khan could have been the richest person in all of human history. However, there's a very important asterisk on that point. Genghis Khan was not one for personal wealth. And while the empire he was the sole heir to was extremely prosperous and rich in both land, resources, livestock, food, and army, Genghis himself did not store much value. He rather decided to invest back into the army to continue the expansion of the Mongolian Empire, which is likely a major contributing factor why the Mongolian Empire was so unstoppable for so long. Genghis ate, slept, lived, and dressed like a majority of his army. And while the actions done by Genghis Khan are, for the most part, deplorable, and the majority of his entire empire was funded by the pillaging and destruction of any other civilization they could, find essentially, it is still somewhat noble that Genghis decided to remain close to his modest roots and invest the wealth that his empire brought him back into his empire to further expand it. And while estimates for Genghis Khan's net worth range from anywhere from a few trillion to over 100 trillion, I would say that Genghis Khan's net worth is almost negligible considering how he viewed money. But because we need a number on this list, let's just call it 100 trillion in access, but maybe 100 billion in execution. Money he actually spent on his own personal lifestyle. And honestly, I think even that's a bit overinflated. The Mongolian people were extremely nomadic, meaning that storing wealth was not necessarily a convenient thing to do. And unless you're Steve from Minecraft, you probably can't store $100 trillion worth of gold in your back pocket. Since Genghis Khan was relatively a modest individual, even though he was likely one of the most powerful people to ever live, I wanted to add a secondary entry for the medieval era, someone you'll likely recognize if you're familiar with ancient, wealthy people. This next individual is a man known as Mansa Musa. And Mansa Musa, in many regards, is considered to be the most wealthy person to ever exist ever. Full stop. And while there's definitely an argument to back up that claim, we'll discuss how accurate that is at the end of the video. Mansa Musa ruled the Mali Empire from roughly 1312 AD to 1337 AD. And under the power of Mansa Musa, Mali was able to reach its peak power, influence, and wealth, controlling almost every key trade route across West Africa. But more notably, Musa's wealth came from the control of trade of salt and gold, which were extremely prevalent in West Africa at the time. But he didn't just profit off the trade of salt and gold. He also profited off the trade of ivory, slaves, spices, and other goods. Or should I say bads, because I don't think calling slaves goods is, well, good. He profited off goods and bads, okay? Regardless, Musa's net worth was immense, and it only grew when he took his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. It was this pilgrimage that not only grew his net worth, but also increased his international fame. Musa traveled with a massive 60,000 person entourage, and he did so because he needed many people to carry all of the gold that he was earning and traveling with. And because he was traveling with so much gold, he would actually just give it away at different cities he was stopping in. And because of this, in cities like Cairo in Egypt, the gold that Musa was just giving away for free actually disrupted local economies. But yeah, Musa was literally kitted out in full gold armor, all gold tools, had an army of 60,000 people in all gold armor, an additional 60,000 camels with all gold armor, an inventory full of gold blocks. This guy made Mr. T's neck look naked, but at least he was generous. So generous, in fact, that he literally caused inflation. But here's where things get interesting. While every number we've discussed is an estimate, the estimate for Mansa Musa is relatively modest, with a net worth believed to be roughly around $400 billion, which is still massive and more money than the richest person in 2025 has. Although it's nowhere near the trillions we've discussed before. And after doing some research, I almost feel like Mansa Musa is known as the richest person to ever live simply because he was talked about so much in ancient texts, because this guy was just a G. If you saw a dude in all gold with 60,000 other gold people just giving out gold, I would probably believe that was the richest guy ever too. But that's not to discredit his legacy. The early modern era. Once again, there's so many good entries for this time period, we're doing a double feature. And we're starting with a man named Jacob Fugger. And Jacob Fugger is a real Fugger indeed. And that's because this man got so rich that he actually had more power over the kings in Europe. And that is saying something. Jacob Fugger was born into a wealthy family and started his career in the textile industry that his family was deeply invested in. Although it didn't take time for Jacob to realize that there was higher leverage opportunities out there. And he shifted his focus from being a merchant to being a bank for merchants. And with that, he made a massive fortune. And with that fortune, he got into some very interesting situations, specifically funding politicians to have power in parliament, and also by expanding his mining operation to create essentially a monopoly over the copper market in Europe. Jacob Fugger had so much money that he was literally known as Jacob Fugger the Rich. But he wasn't only known as a businessman. Like I mentioned, his career in politics made him known as a kingmaker, because he was giving out massive loans to Maximilian I and Charles V, both of which who ended up becoming massively powerful people within Europe. But Fugger wasn't only funding kings, he literally financed the creation of the Vatican. And to bankroll the construction of the Vatican, he actually started minting his own coins known as papal coins. And it was actually with Fugger's involvement with the Vatican that led to the eventual sale of indulgences, which was literally a ticket to heaven, which eventually sparked the entire Protestant Reformation. Regardless, Jacob Fugger was a very rich man. From textiles to mining to banker, Fugger did it all. And while he didn't do it all ethically, he did it. And it's estimated that his personal net worth was roughly 2% of Europe's GDP at the time, which would equate to roughly $400 billion in today's money. And interestingly, Jacob Fugger's net worth is one of the most provable net worths we've discussed so far, considering there are many records to validate these claims that are publicly available and, well, still exist. So even though 400 billion doesn't sound super impressive at this point in time, the power that he held as a non-royal was insane. And his net worth is likely one of the most accurate and non-inflated we've discussed so far. But like I mentioned, we got a double feature, so let's get that Fugger out of the way and discuss Akbar the Great. Akbar the Great was the third emperor of the Mughal Empire in India, and he ruled this empire from 1556 until his death in 1605. Interestingly, Akbar gained access to the throne at only 13 years old, when his father tragically died. And while giving a 13-year-old reign over an entire empire sounds like a horrible idea and has been proven to be multiple times throughout history, for Akbar, it actually worked out. It's almost like being a child actor. In most cases, it works out horribly, but sometimes it actually kind of does work out. His reign is remembered for vast land expansion, the flourishing of Indian culture, and strong central governance, which was largely missing at the time. And it was these primary contributing factors that made the Mughal Empire one of the wealthiest and most powerful states in the early modern era. The wealth that Akbar generated for the Mughal Empire was actually primarily driven by agriculture, as the lands of northern India were extremely fertile. But of course, in addition to this agriculture, he also made most of his money from taxation, both taxing those crops and other goods. On top of agriculture and taxation, once again, control of trade routes was a steady stream of income that allowed the Mughal Empire to grow and flourish. And due to this political success and economic growth, he ended up making the empire extremely rich, like 25% of the entire world's GDP rich, which equates to roughly $30 trillion in today's money. And unlike Genghis Khan, Akbar knew how to spend some money. He was known for his opulence, and so were his courtrooms and official government buildings. I wanted to add these two examples specifically for the early modern era because the examples are so vastly different, both in how they started their lives, acquired their wealth, and obviously the shocking difference in net worth between these two individuals. But keep in mind, for Akbar specifically, this 25% of global GDP is the wealth of the empire he controlled, not his personal wealth. And while that line was relatively blurred, even if we say he conservatively only paid himself 10% of that, we can estimate that his personal net worth was roughly around 3 trillion, although he had access to up to 30 trillion. So I'll let you be the judge of that. The modern era. Ladies and gentlemen, we have finally made it to the time period that we are currently existing in. With that being said, the modern era is considered to be from 1800 to today, meaning that we have a lot of ground to cover and many notable and documented individuals to discuss. So for that reason, I'm going to make this last time period a bit of a speed round. I want to first discuss Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man who lived from 1794 to 1877, and he was a man who was known as the first American business tycoon. And that he was. Vanderbilt built his fortune primarily through shipping routes and railroads, and he started his career as a ferry operator in the New York City harbor, where he was first exposed to commercial transportation, which later inspired him to start his focus on railroads and expansion across all of America. That being said, Vanderbilt wasn't necessarily a good guy, and he actually earned the name of robber baron as well, because he would typically use monopolistic strategies and market manipulation in his favor to buy railroads as cheaply as possible and extract the most value out of them. Regardless, Vanderbilt is known as one of the men that built America as we know it today, and the railroad systems that he established connecting U.S. U.S. cities and boosting American trade are still marveled at to this very day. At the time of his death, Vanderbilt's net worth was roughly $3 billion in today's money. And interestingly, when he died, he was worth more than the U.S. Treasury. So even though $3 billion sounds puny in the video, within context, that number is massive. Cornelius died in 1877, and interestingly, in 1973, only 100 years later, it was found out that during a family reunion, there was not one single millionaire left in the family. That's right, the Vanderbilt family literally blew billions of dollars in less than 100 years through financial mismanagement and, I'm sure, other reasons. And besides Cornelius, another major player during the beginning of the modern era was a man known as John D. Rockefeller. And Rockefeller, he did. Rockefeller was one of the most prolific industrialists in American history, and he was the founder of the Standard Oil Company during the Industrial Revolution, a time when oil was an emerging market. And he was not only capitalizing on it, he was monopolizing on it. I think it's also important to note that during this time, business was nowhere near what it's like today. Like, if you're complaining about modern day capitalism, then you should have seen 1800s capitalism. There was absolutely no regard for the environment, other business people, families, children, nothing. The Industrial Revolution was full of factories that had pregnant women and children working all day, with reckless disposal of industrial waste, and the most strong-arm, backstabby business tactics you've literally ever heard of. 1800s Industrial Revolution business was not for the faint of heart. And fortunately for Rockefeller, this was a game he was willing to play. When Rockefeller launched Standard Oil in 1870, he grew the company rapidly by essentially undercutting all of his competition. And then with the revenue he gained through undercutting this competition, he then bought out all of his competitors. And only 2 years after starting Standard Oil in 1872, there was a small few-month streak where Rockefeller bought 22 of the 26 oil refineries in Cleveland alone. And this purchasing streak was so impactful on Cleveland that it was literally known as the Cleveland Massacre. But Rockefeller didn't just undercut and buy every oil refinery he could. He also made sure to integrate vertically, controlling everything from the production, transportation, and sales of any oil product. And during the late 1870s, Standard Oil was literally refining over 90% of America's oil. And eventually, people were fed up with it. And I think in some cases, Rockefeller was truly seen as the first real example of true corporate greed, a symbol and theme that would continue until, well, today. Rockefeller's company, Standard Oil, got so big, in fact, that in 1911, the Supreme Court forced him to break up his company into 34 smaller companies, which he did, and ironically, this division only led to an increase of net worth for Rockefeller. Rockefeller was not a good guy, but there are a lot of things we use every single day that have been influenced from his work, and it was people like him that built the society we live in today, whether you like it or not. Rockefeller's net worth was estimated to be equivalent to almost 2% of all of the US's GDP, and he's also considered to be the world's first billionaire. And while there's definitely other honorable mentions from the beginning part of the modern era, like the Rothschilds and Henry Ford, I want to fast forward to the modern day to discuss some of the richest people in 2025, and also reflect on all of the rich people we've discussed and determine who is the richest of all. As of today, the world's richest man is largely believed to be Elon Musk. But besides Elon Musk, some other notable billionaires include Jeffrey Bezos, Bill Gates, and Bernard Arnault. And while I think most of us understand who these people are and how they made their money, I think it's important to reflect on how their net worths differ from people in the past. For example, you don't see Elon Musk storing all of his net worth in gold or taking a 60,000 person pilgrimage across Africa with gold armor on. A majority of his wealth is in shares, stocks, and is largely based off of the evaluation of the companies that he owns. Now, if we stack up Elon Musk's net worth of roughly $382 billion at the time of recording this video, he actually ranks relatively low in the context of this list. And for that reason, this video is about to get rather subjective, because to answer the question of who's the richest person in human history, there's a few different answers, at least in my opinion. If you want to base the ranking of history's richest person based off the numerical value, which, I mean, is logical, then I would say that honestly Genghis Khan has an extremely strong case for richest person ever. Although, if you want to base it off popular vote, there is a lot of people, for good reason, that believe that Mansa Musa was the richest person to ever walk this earth. However, if you're asking me who the richest person in all of human history is, genuinely, I would say that there has to be more factors beyond just wealth we consider. Because while Genghis Khan may have potentially had the most access to wealth, he personally wasn't extremely wealthy and also lived a lifestyle I have absolutely no interest in. And to be frank, I really don't have much interest in living any time before, I guess, 1990. The reason being, maybe I'm just spoiled, but I enjoy modern luxuries of today. And I would argue that somebody with a minimum wage job in America today lives a much better life than a king did in medieval times. Specifically because the technology, medicine, entertainment, and modern luxuries far outweigh any amount of gold, at least in my opinion. And I guess you have to ask yourself, do you want to be in a castle with a jester and a pile of unlimited gold? Or do you want a toilet that flushes, air conditioning, and access to YouTube to watch Trusty Bro? That's the question. I'll let you decide in the comments. But if you're asking me who I think the richest person in all of human history is, I would definitely argue that Elon Musk takes the cake, simply because his net worth is massive, he's the most prosperous man in the most prosperous era of human history, and he's also able to enjoy his money during the best time to ever live in human history, which is today, in my opinion. How you would die on every planet. This is you on Mercury. This is you on Saturn. And this is you in Uranus. What's the commonality between all of these versions of you? Well, they're all dead. And that's because basically every planet in our solar system is uninhabitable. But today, we're gonna explain exactly how you got to all of these planets and what about these planets caused you such a harsh and painful death. And to do that, let's take a couple steps back. Before you died on any of these planets, you are the bravest astronaut this side of the Mississippi. And NASA has decided that now is the time that we embark on interplanetary travel. Luckily for you, NASA has developed a special technology that has granted you the perfect number of respawns to die on every planet and still come back in one piece. Because after all, they know that you're just a squishy little guy, and these planets are pretty crazy. But without further ado, let's get to our first planet and experience just exactly how it would kill you. You're now officially approaching the very first planet in the entire solar system, Mercury. Instantly, you're met with two options. Do you land on the light side, or do you land on the dark side? And although you're equipped with limited respawns, you understand that you have some wiggle room, and you decide to first land on the light side. One of the first things you notice as you descend closer and closer to the surface of Mercury is that you're experiencing very little atmospheric drag. And that's because there's actually no atmosphere on Mercury. Mercury only has a thin exosphere. When your rocket ship descends onto Earth, you notice the atmospheric drag and you feel the resistance. You can see the flames out of the window on the side of the ship. And that's because Earth has a strong atmosphere, but Mercury has no such thing, which already brings us to our first probable cause of death, which is a hard impact. Your spaceship isn't equipped for such a thin atmosphere, and for that reason, your landing is extra harsh. Although, miraculously, you and your ship survive. And you're now on the surface of Mercury. And before you even step out of your ship, you notice that the surface is bumpy and mountainous, and that's due to this lack of atmosphere. Just like how your ship experienced no atmospheric drag, meteorites don't either, meaning that they don't burn up when they enter the planet's exosphere. They keep going until they impact the ground hard, making the surface of Mercury look like an abandoned war zone. Regardless, you press the button, open the door, and you step foot onto the surface of Mercury. And within seconds, the spacesuit that your life depends on fails and begins to melt. The pressure that your spacesuit maintains to keep oxygen in the suit is gone due to burn holes that have appeared throughout the suit. And now you and your spacesuit are melting on the surface of Mercury, and before you're even able to gasp for air, your skin is boiling, your organs are shutting down, and you are dead before you can even asphyxiate from the lack of oxygen. That was probably quicker than you thought, but that's just the harsh reality of the light side of Mercury. Because Mercury has no atmosphere and a very thin exosphere, you are directly exposed to the harsh sun in full effect. And what that looks like, at least for the warm side of the planet, is temperatures approaching 427 degrees Celsius, which, like I mentioned, is enough to essentially cook you in seconds. But it doesn't just stop there, because not only does the lack of atmosphere not protect you from the sun's heat and radiation, but the lack of atmospheric pressure also means that the boiling point of water is significantly lower, which means that not only would all of your organs fail due to the sheer heat your body is experiencing, but also all of your bodily fluids would almost instantly evaporate. So yeah, the light side of Mercury is nothing to mess with, and the sheer unprotected exposure to the sun would kill, vaporize, and melt you in a matter of seconds. And even if it didn't, even if you were the most heat-resistant person in the world, there's also no oxygen, which kind of just seems like a cliff note at this point, but it is true, there's still no oxygen, even if you could survive this heat. You've respawned safely in your spaceship, and you've decided that you're just gonna wait for night to come to you. And you wait 1 hour, 8 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours. And at this point, you're curious if night's ever going to come. And the reality is, it likely won't come for a long time. And that's because Mercury rotates extremely slow, meaning that 1 day on Mercury is actually 176 days on Earth. So instead of waiting a half year for nighttime to come, you decide to fly your ship to the dark side of Mercury to see if that's any more inhabitable. Your ship lands and it's dark, although the lights on your ship and the distant glimmer of stars is enough to illuminate the surface of the planet for you to kind of walk around. You press the button, open the ship door, and take your first steps onto the surface of Mercury during nighttime. Instantly, you're relieved that you're not melting or having your blood boil, but you're now realizing what you are dealing with: a severe lack of heat. The nighttime temperatures on Mercury can get as low as negative 180 degrees Celsius, which may seem strange because this planet is the closest to the sun, but due to the lack of atmosphere, Mercury is very poorly insulated and not able to maintain and spread this heat across the planet, leaving you with almost only two extremes. After spending a few seconds on the surface, you realize that your spacesuit is once again not equipped for the sheer lack of heat, and you you notice the cold to begin to penetrate your suit and cause severe internal damage. Your visor is instantly fogged up from your breath. Your nose, fingers, and toes are instantly turned numb and turning black with frostbite. At a molecular level, ice crystals are forming inside of your cells, causing internal damage, and your body is beginning to shut down. You can try to move around all you want to try to generate more body heat, but it's simply not going to work. And even if your spacesuit is able to maintain pressure and give you oxygen, within a few minutes, hypothermia will set in and you will be dead. You once again respawn in your ship and realize that there is a third option for landing, a potential Goldilocks zone. You notice that the daytime is too harsh and the nighttime is too harsh. However, there is a strip in the middle of the planet where night meets day, and you decide to land there. Scientifically, and this is real, this area is known as the Terminator Zone, and it's the most moderate place on the entire planet, which is kind of ironic. Regardless, you fly to the Terminator Zone, you land, and you step out of the ship. The part of the Terminator Zone that you find yourself in is on the warm side, not the cold side. You're experiencing more of the sun exposure. However, it's not nearly to the same degree that you experienced on the daytime side. Although this moderate temperature still far exceeds the temperature that your NASA spacesuit is able to tolerate. And I guess that this is a good time to mention, because in this hypothetical, we're using NASA's most current flagship spacesuit, which is rated to tolerate temperatures up to 121 degrees Celsius and as cold as negative 157 degrees Celsius, meaning that the suit definitely gives you a huge advantage over being, well, naked, but it's simply no match for the harsh conditions of Mercury. And for that reason, you once again find yourself dead within minutes. Leaving Mercury with your captain's logs full, you now make your way to the next planet in the solar system, Venus. Not to be confused with Penis. I don't know what happened there, but yeah, we're heading to Venus. Your ship is now orbiting Venus, and you begin your descent into this mysterious red-looking planet. As you descend closer to the surface of this planet, you can't help but notice the sheer opposites that you have just experienced. As you're descending closer to the surface of Venus, you are seeing clouds almost everywhere. Thick clouds at that. It's almost like a dark fog, and the closer you get to the surface of Venus, the darker things have become, which in contrast to Mercury is total night and day, because Mercury had no atmosphere, meaning no clouds, no air resistance, nothing. Venus, on the other hand, has an abundance of air pressure, meaning that your landing is relatively easy and light. But the pleasantries of Venus are about to end. Your ship gently lands on the surface and almost instantly begins to make creaking noises. These are noises you haven't yet heard from your ship, but you continue on. You press the button, open the bay door, and step onto the surface of Venus, where you're met with familiar and extremely unfamiliar problems. The first familiar problem is the extreme heat. The surface of Venus is actually hotter than the surface of Mercury, reaching temperatures of 464 degrees Celsius, which is hot enough to melt lead. And because of this, like on Mercury, the integrity of your suit is compromised, you have lost all air, your skin is melting, your liquids are evaporating, and you are dead within seconds. But let's just say, hypothetically, if your suit was able to handle this amount of heat, well, you wouldn't last much longer at all. And that's because Venus has a very unique atmosphere. Atmospheric pressure is sometimes calculated in bar. And for example, on Earth at sea level, the atmospheric pressure is 1 bar. If you've ever seen a watch that's waterproof, it might say 5 bar or something along those lines, and that just means it can tolerate higher pressure from being underwater. Well, the atmospheric pressure on Venus is 92 bar, meaning that its atmosphere is 92 times denser than Earth's. So even though Venus is a similar size to Earth and the gravity you would experience on this planet is relatively similar, because of the sheer atmospheric pressure, as soon as you step foot on this planet, your body would almost instantly collapse. This amount of atmospheric pressure is almost equivalent to being 1.6 kilometers under the ocean. But not only would movement be extremely hard and your body would even struggle to stand, but the sheer amount of pressure would also instantly rupture your eardrums and force all of the air out of your lungs. And if those things for some reason didn't kill you, the collapsing of all of your blood vessels definitely would. And as your dead body lays on the surface of Venus, it begins to rain. But this rain isn't any regular rain. This rain from the clouds that you saw is sulfuric acid, which at this point is basically just adding insult to injury. Because not only does your body essentially instantly vaporize, but it's also crushed and then melted by the acidic rain and fog that exists almost everywhere on this hellish planet. There's no Goldilocks zone or Terminator zone or good zone on Venus. It's all a thick fog of acid, extreme heat, extreme pressure, and it's extremely not fun. You respawn on your ship moments before the structural integrity of that collapses, and you begin your journey to your next planet, This planet looks familiar, but you just can't quite put your finger on it. You can see white, fluffy clouds from the atmosphere, huge, beautiful blue oceans, vast green landscapes, and vast brown deserts. You pick a random spot and decide to descend. The first place you decide to descend is an island just off the coast of India. You know that you're on Earth and realize that you likely don't even need your spacesuit, but you keep it on anyway. You press the button, open the door, and you walk onto this island off the coast of India. And instantly you realize that you're on North Sentinel Island. You try to turn around and get back to your ship, but you get an arrow through both of your knees. And before you can even say a prayer, you have been killed. And realize that maybe landing on North Sentinel Island wasn't the best place to land. You respawn in your ship, fly back up to orbit, and pick another location, this time on an island off the coast of Brazil, far away from India and any sort of uncontacted tribe, right? You land your ship, you open the door, and you step onto this island to realize that there's no people here at all. You can breathe. You take off your helmet and enjoy being home for once. Until you realize multiple snakes slithering up your legs, and you now have multiple venomous snakes in your spacesuit, and you're currently dying on Snake Island. You respawn in your ship, fly back up to orbit, and realize you're done. You're not going to any more uninhabited islands. You pick somewhere central in the United States and decide to land. You press the map, you open the door, and you realize that you've just landed in Gary, Indiana. You take your first few steps to admire the abandoned buildings. But before you know it, your spaceship is being stolen and sold for drugs, your space boots are being stolen off your feet, and you've just been stabbed for wearing a fancy-looking spacesuit. You lasted a noble 20 seconds. Obviously, I'm just being satirical here. There's more ways you could die on Earth than I could ever possibly mention. Although, if you did want to watch a couple videos about how you could die on Earth, there's a lot of videos on my channel that go into detail about that. You respawn in your spaceship, take a deep breath, and prepare for your next planet. You're approaching Mars, and already you're kind of scarred from red-looking planets, but you know that this planet is different, and you're excited to see how different this planet really is. You orbit the planet, and then begin your descent to the surface of Mars. Upon your descent, you're pleased to see that there is no sulfuric acid clouds or rain or gas anywhere, although you realize that's likely a result of the low atmospheric pressure that exists on Mars, and unfortunately, we now know the result of low atmospheric pressure. You have another harsh landing due to the lack of air resistance, and after the reddish dust settles from your impact, you open the door and take your first steps onto the surface of Mars. It's daytime, and you're pleasantly surprised because the temperature is extremely moderate. During the daytime, the temperature of Mars only gets to around 20 degrees Celsius, which is comfortable. Because of the distance that we now are from the sun, the temperature is not nearly as severe as it was on Mercury. However, there is still a big difference with the lack of atmosphere, and it's kind of twofold. The first issue is the radiation from the sun is still strong, 40 to 50 times stronger than it is on the Earth, which is concerning. And also, when nighttime comes and the heat from the sun is no longer available, the temperatures can get as cold as negative 153 degrees Celsius, which would kill you in a similar fashion as to what we explained before. But because we know how you would die on an extremely cold planet, and because you landed during the daytime on Mars, let's just discuss this situation. You're on the surface of Mars, the temperature is pleasant, and so far, things are looking good. Mars is the second most habitable planet in our solar system and is the most likely candidate to be a place where people could live, although that doesn't necessarily mean it's habitable at all. Besides the lack of atmosphere and extremely cold temperatures, Mars's air is almost solely comprised of carbon dioxide, which, if you try to breathe, would cause a panic attack and hypoxia and then suffocation, all within minutes. Although within your spacesuit, that's not an issue for now. However, what is an issue is the radiation exposure and severe sandstorms. And the sandstorms on Mars are intense. Winds can approach 100 kilometers per hour, and the abrasive nature of the sand could easily strip the paint off your spaceship, wear down your spacesuit, and essentially turn your helmet's visor from clear glass into frosted glass in a few minutes. But even still, you're not quite dead yet, and throughout the rest of the day on Mars, you could live, assuming you have at least enough oxygen in your spacesuit to explore the barren surface. Although, when night comes, temperatures will drop, and you will be no longer. You respawn on the ship and head off to your next planet. And this is the beginning of things getting really crazy. As you approach the next planet, you realize something different. This planet is massive. It's not only the biggest planet that we've explored so far, but it's also the biggest planet in the entire solar system. This planet is Jupiter, and as you begin to successfully orbit this planet, you realize something. You're experiencing radiation sickness, and that's because Jupiter is extremely toxic. And before you can even get anywhere near the surface of Jupiter, which we'll discuss that in a second, you are going to be feeling the effects of the extreme radiation that comes from this toxic planet. But assuming you you and your suit are built different, you begin your descent into the planet of Jupiter. One of the first things that you're going to experience is the strange upper clouds. They're not made of sulfuric acid like on Venus. These clouds are lighter in color and composed of water vapor and ammonia. The temperature that we're already experiencing on the descent is already more than our suit can handle. But you're still in your ship and you're still safe for now. So you continue to descend. You notice things similar to Venus begin to get darker and darker, but more intensely than it did on Venus. And with that, you're also noticing that your ship is creaking, similar to what it did on Venus, meaning that the atmospheric pressure is getting intense. You would think that with Jupiter being so massive, its gravitational forces would be huge as well, but Jupiter's gravity is only about 2.4 times stronger than the gravity we experience here on Earth. As your descent continues and you're looking out the window, it's nearly pitch black and you can't see anything. Light isn't able to make it this deep onto the planet, and the pressure is getting intense. Even just 50 kilometers into the planet of Jupiter will have you experiencing pressure equivalent to around 1,000 bar. Keep in mind, the pressure on Venus was 92 bar. You're only 50 kilometers into Jupiter, and you're experiencing 1,000 bar pressure. Now, if you weren't in your indestructible ship, you would have frozen and been crushed into a ball long ago. But because you're in your ship, you're still continuing further. As the pressure increases and as you go deeper and deeper into the planet of Jupiter, one thing that you notice is peculiar is that it's no longer cold. It's actually hot, really hot. You notice that the temperature gauge on the outside of the ship is over 1,000 degrees Celsius, which, if you were exposed to, would instantly vaporize you. But because you're in your ship, you're still safe and still continuing deeper into the planet. At this point, you're struggling to decide when you can even get out of the ship and if you can at all. Because at this point, you've experienced extreme cold, extreme pressure, extreme heat, and now you're experiencing extreme storms with winds up to 400 kilometers per hour. And there's still no sign of any solid surface for you to land your ship on. You notice your ship reach something. It's not ground, but it's a liquidy surface, and it's good enough for you. You press the button, open the spaceship door, you step onto this surface of metallic hydrogen where your feet essentially get stuck and your body is instantly crushed and melted before you can even process what happened. Jupiter's a bit of a tough one because the deeper you go, the more hypothetical you get. And right now, the kind of going theory is that there is a core of metallic hydrogen and other heavy metals in liquid form, potentially surrounding a solid core, but also potentially not. The pressure and temperatures at the core of Jupiter are unimaginably intense. And in the instance of this experiment, this is as deep as you're gonna go, because your mission was to find out how you would die on Jupiter, not what the core of Jupiter is. Although that mission might have been a more productive mission to go on. However, right now the theory is actually that the core of Jupiter could potentially be hotter than the surface of the sun, which, if true, is just crazy to think about. But you don't have time to think, because you're already on your way to your next planet. And this planet, once again, poses brand new challenges. The challenges with surviving this planet begin with even getting close to it, because not only does Saturn have a plethora of moons, 146 as of now, but it also has its huge, massive, and cool rings, which are literally just orbiting pieces of older moons that crashed into each other or exploded for, I guess, other reasons. So before we even get close to this planet, we have a game of Space Invaders, avoiding asteroids and moon debris. But because you're a legend, you avoid all of that and you begin to get closer to Saturn, and you realize that you're going to be experiencing a lot of similarities to Jupiter. Specifically because this planet is once again massive, and it's also comprised out of the same gases, helium and hydrogen. So you already know you're in for a world of pain. Literally a world of pain. Since the composition of Saturn is relatively similar to the composition of Jupiter, you decide that you're not going to wait until you reach some sort of core to get out of your spaceship. You're going to make sure that you're deep enough into the planet where it's dark and you know that you're fully immersed within the planet's contents, and then you're going to see what happens. And that's exactly what you did. You begin breaking through the initial clouds, and instantly you're once again met with ammonia crystals in the air and clouds and a thicker and denser fog. Your ship begins to descend slowly, your windows get covered in frost, and it begins to get darker and darker. And you realize that it's time to step out of the ship and see what happens. You press the button, the door opens, you step out, and you jump into the abyss. As soon as you step off of the ledge, you're not falling straight down. You are smacked by 1,800 km/h winds throwing you in multiple directions, as Saturn is experiencing consistent storms that would literally rip your body apart almost instantly. At this point, assuming you're extremely damaged but not killed, your body, flying around and spinning out of control, begins to fall deeper into Saturn. Already, the extreme cold is freezing you and killing you within your spacesuit, and the pressure is only getting more and more intense. But because on this particular day you were feeling extra resilient, you're able to survive these extremely cold temperatures and this wind and this intense pressure. You realize that the further you fall, once again, the warmer it gets. And the pressure only gets more and more bone crushing, until soon enough, your body lands into this metallic liquid surface, and your body is now literally a drop in the bucket. What used to be a human body in a spacesuit is now a vaporized liquid drop in an unbelievably hot core of a gas giant planet. You respawn your ship. Fortunately, it's close to the surface. You exit this planet, make it through the minefield of moons and moon fragments once again, and you're out of the woods. You're no longer going into gas giants, but you're now getting into ice giants. And these planets aren't much better at all. And that's because they are still literally gas giants. They're not made of ice. They are just comprised of elements that are heavier than helium. And they are obviously extremely cold. Approaching the next planet in the first ice giant, you once again have to navigate a minefield of moon fragments. And once you've successfully navigated that, you are met with a beautiful sight. You look outside the window and bestow your eyes upon Uranus. Obviously, upon seeing it, the first thing you want to do is just get inside it. You need to penetrate Uranus to see what's inside, right? That's what this mission is all about. So before you could even orbit this planet, you simply begin to descend. And soon enough, you're penetrating the surface of Uranus. One of the first things that you notice is how dark it is at this part of the solar system. You are so far from the sun that even on the surface of Uranus, the surface level clouds, it is already pretty dark, and it's only gonna get darker the deeper you go. Upon penetrating Uranus, you're met with unbreathable and some toxic gases, with the majority of Uranus's atmosphere being comprised of hydrogen, helium, and methane, none of which are breathable for humans. But you've got your spacesuit on, and you're still in your ship, so you continue to dive deeper. It's not long before you notice the extreme cold, with temperatures already reaching negative 195 degrees Celsius, which, if you were outside, would be enough to almost instantly kill you. But you're still in your ship and still descending deeper into Uranus. And now you are getting into the heart of some of the storms happening on Uranus, with winds up to 900 kilometers per hour. Winds that could potentially be fatal and at the very least mess you up horribly. And as you continue to descend, it is extremely dark, the winds are horrible, and now your ship is being pelted. Initially by ice-like crystals, and the deeper you go, you notice that these aren't crystals anymore. These are fully formed diamonds being pelted at your spaceship at over 900 kilometers per hour, something you haven't seen up until now. And at this moment, you're inspired to get out. You still haven't met any sort of solid surface yet, but you park your ship by hovering it, you press the button, and step out. You step into a 900 kilometer per hour gust of wind and instantly are pelted with another gust of wind carrying diamonds in the opposite direction, going again 900 kilometers per hour, having your entire body be penetrated by these diamond fragments. And while you are dying and bleeding out and asphyxiating due to all of the holes in your spacesuit, you begin to notice the immense pressure crushing your body smaller and smaller in the intense heat that now exists at this deeper level. Uranus is regarded as the coldest planet in the solar system, but at this point, near the core of the planet, it is extremely hot, and you are being crushed, melted, vaporized, and pelted with diamonds. A fate quite similar to the last few you experienced, although this one at least includes diamonds, which is cool. But I think at this point, it's safe to say, playing in Uranus can definitely get dangerous. You're back on your ship, safe, and you're happy to be out of Uranus. So you quickly head to the final planet on this list, the second and final ice giant, that being Neptune. Now, I'll be honest, Neptune is extremely similar to Uranus as far as composition and what exactly would happen if you were to experience this planet. And because I can't make as many puns with this planet, I'm gonna keep this one relatively brief. Assuming you penetrate the surface of Neptune and decide to park the ship there and simply jump into the void, you would experience extremely cold temperatures, followed by extreme winds, and then rising temperatures and rising pressure until you're pelted by, once again, diamond rain, and then disintegrated into the darkness and abyss that is the core of Neptune. A story similar to the previous planets, but no less severe. Your death on Neptune, while instant, would be horrible. You respawn on your ship, and before heading back to Earth, you realize that you still have one respawn left. And because this is Trust Me Bro, and we're always extra, we decide to head to the forgotten planet of our lifetime. The dwarf planet that still exists in our solar system, but is no longer recognized as an official planet, and that would be Pluto. One of the first ways you could die in regards to Pluto is dying of boredom, because Pluto is so damn far away. But because we have Instagram Reels, you're able to entertain yourself for the entirety of the trip, and you are now orbiting the dwarf planet that nobody loves. You make your descent onto the surface of this planet, and you can only help but notice how small it is. It almost reminds you of the moon. But as you look back towards the sun, you notice something you haven't seen before. The sun, at this point, almost looks like a star in the distance. Sure, you can tell it's the sun, but it's at this point exceedingly small, and much smaller than it was when you were on Mercury. And speaking of Mercury, you notice once again that Pluto has almost no atmosphere, meaning that your landing was rough and you are in for some extremely strange experiences. Being this far from the sun means that it's dark and cold all of the time. And this is something that, at this point, you're just prepared for. You hit the button and step into negative 229 degrees Celsius temperatures, a temperature that you may notice is actually colder than liquid nitrogen. And because the surface of this planet is colder than liquid nitrogen, you would essentially experience what it would feel like to jump into a pool of liquid nitrogen. Any liquid on or around your body would instantly be boiled, and your skin would feel like it's almost burning. We've reached temperatures so cold they feel hot once again. Your skin would freeze, and all of your flesh, including your muscles, your fat, your everything, begin to turn into a frigid, hard solid. Every cell in your body would die and turn black, and your dark, mummified body would essentially live on as a statue on the surface of Pluto, literally frozen in time. And my only hope for you would be that you left yourself in a funny position, if you even had time to get there. And with that, you use your last respawn, you get back in your ship, and you head back to Earth. You have multiple logbooks full of your experience being documented, and once you return to NASA and hand in this information, they regretfully inform you that they appreciate you going on this trip, but they actually just developed a drone that could have done all of this. And the worst part is, they actually developed it before you left. But because you seemed so excited about going, they didn't want to break your spirit, so they let you go anyway. But at least you got to play in Uranus. The craziest prison escapes of all time. The Alcatraz escape. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, better known as Alcatraz, is likely the most iconic prison in the entire world. Alcatraz sits on top of a small island in the San Francisco Bay and started its life in the 1850s as a military fort, and then was converted to a military prison in the 1910s. And in the 1930s, the United States Department of Justice bought the military prison and turned it into what we know it as today, a former maximum security federal prison. Alcatraz was notorious for a couple of reasons, both of those reasons being extremely tied together. For starters, it was notorious because it was literally seen as an escape-proof prison. And that was because it combined the highest level technology possible within the walls of this prison, and it also coupled that with timeless prehistoric technology outside of the prison walls. What I mean by that is the literal mile of rough, shark-infested water surrounding the prison, making it extremely unique and almost one of a kind. Because sure, being inside a maximum security prison with all of the bells and whistles is one thing, but having all of those in combination with being on a remote island surrounded by rough, shark-infested water is just a whole nother level. And that is partially what made Alcatraz so famous. But obviously, they don't build these prisons for great people. These federal maximum security prisons exist for a reason, which brings us to the second reason why this prison was so notorious. It was home to some of the most infamous criminals of its time. For example, Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, Alvin Karpis, and a bunch of others. So yeah, it's safe to assume that Alcatraz was likely the one prison that nobody could escape from. And from 1933 until 1962, that was considered true. There was multiple escape attempts, but none that were considered successful. That was until June 11th of 1962, when three men would cause not only national headlines, but also an ongoing mystery that still puzzles the world to this very day. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were lifelong criminals, and by the time they had ended up at Alcatraz, they were no strangers to escape attempts. Frank Morris started his criminal career at the age of 13 and lived a life of crime primarily consisting of drugs and robbery. And throughout his time being in and out of the system, he had escaped multiple times from multiple different correctional facilities. He was likely able to escape due to his extremely high intelligence, and is recorded to have an IQ of 133, which is in the top 2% of the general population. But unfortunately, he decided to use his powers for evil. On the other hand, the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, didn't start their criminal career much later. Clarence was caught breaking into a service station when he was only 14 years old, and the brothers began robbing banks together not long after. They too had multiple escape attempts and successful escapes on their record, which may not come as a surprise considering the context of this video. Now that we have all of the information, one question still remains. What happens when you mix an inescapable prison with criminals that cannot be contained? Well, the answer lies in the following story. A story that is shrouded in irony, because sure, why wouldn't you want to have all of the extremely dangerous bad guys in one place? Well, because then you have all of the bad guys in one place where they can work together. And that is exactly what happened. Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin, and Alan West actually knew each other from previous convictions in Florida and Georgia. I guess you really are the sum of the 5 people you hang out with. Regardless, with all of their histories of prison escapes, it didn't take long for them to begin plotting their escape from Alcatraz, the prison that you're supposedly not able to escape. And after coming together to join forces, they come up with a plan to escape. And this plan starts by chipping away at cement. Oh, and if you're curious why I didn't mention Alan West earlier, you'll see why later. Just trust me. Obviously, being in a maximum security prison leaves minimal opportunities for easy escapes. But these criminals identified the weakest point of their cell being not the door, but the vent that was hidden under everybody's sink. And for a 6-month period, all 4 of these men begin widening the ducts beneath their sinks using saw blades, metal spoons, electric drill bits, anything they could get their hands on that would chip away at the cement. Now, this alone brings up 2 questions. How did they hide the hole, and how did they cover the sound of chipping away at cement? Well, 2 simple answers. In regards to how they would hide chipping away at the hole, first of all, these men would take turn being on guard, watching for the guards that would typically only do their hourly patrol, but sometimes would do spontaneous patrols as well, where they would need to obviously make sure that the guards did not see them digging these holes. And once their daily digging session was complete, how they concealed them from the guards throughout the rest of the day when they weren't digging them was actually quite clever. All of these men made papier-mâché replicas of the vent and surrounding wall area, painted in the same color as the wall, from paint that one of these men stole from their prison job. How they covered the noise of digging was because one of the men actually played the accordion, and during music hour was the perfect opportunity to quickly and loudly bang away at the cement. Now, after roughly 6 months of digging, all of these men had access to what was behind their wall. And obviously, this hole just didn't go outside. It led to a gap between the walls, consisting primarily of pipes. This unguarded utility area between cells was the perfect place to assess the situation. And once these men had access to this corridor, they climbed the pipes and found the closest exit they could find, which happened to be a vacant top-level cell block where they set up a secret workshop. The men weren't going to be escaping at this point in time, but they were getting extremely close to their great escape. In this vacant cell block, the men identified their escape route, which was a ceiling vent that they would need to pry open, but for them, that was no big task. And they spent the next few months bringing supplies up to their secret workshop, specifically raincoats, glues, magazines, pieces of plywood, anything that would be helpful and useful for their escape. Over time, the men were beginning to stitch together raincoats to build a makeshift raft and putting together pieces of plywood to make makeshift paddles. And also reading magazines about water safety and mechanics to help educate themselves on the best way to essentially act on the water and make something to potentially float across the water. It was really quite ingenious. And once they had their raft, paddle, and escape vent pried open, they were ready to make their escape. Around 10 p.m. on June 11th, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers got out of their bed, put replica papier-mâché heads into their bed to make it appear that they were still in bed, and met up together in their secret workshop, where they grabbed their raft, broke the ceiling vent, and began their escape. These men climbed out of the vent on the ceiling onto the roof of Alcatraz, and then descended 50 feet off of the prison roof onto the prison grounds, hauling all of their gear while sliding down a kitchen vent pipe. The men somehow avoided the sniper towers and outdoor guards and climbed the 12-foot barbed wire fences and planted their boat in water on the shore that was a blind spot to searchlights and gun towers. And at that point, they had inflated their raft with an accordion and set sail. And the 3 of these men were never seen again. Now you might be asking yourself, wait, the 3 of these men? What happened to the 4th man? Well, Alan West wasn't as lucky as the other criminals. And on the night of the escape, when West tried to remove the papier-mâché concrete concoction that was covering the hole in the wall, he couldn't. The concrete that he had used to temporarily hold the vent in place during the day had hardened. And by the time he finally got the vent off and was able to make it to the secret workshop, the rest of the men were gone. And West simply accepted his fate and went back to his cell where he went to bed. That story alone is insane, and it's still not over yet. The 3 men had essentially made the perfect escape, and nobody knew of their escape until the next morning, when guards were doing their rounds and noticed that these 3 men were not waking up. And when one of the guards tried to poke Frank Morris in the head with his club, Morris's head literally fell to the ground. And it was at that moment when the prison guards had discovered that they had 3 men on the loose. The following day, on June 12th, almost instantly, military and law enforcement agencies began investigations on the air, land, and sea surrounding the prison. And while some bits and pieces of items used by the escapees were found spread across the general area, there is no recorded evidence of what happened to the 3 men after they left the Alcatraz grounds. During the investigation that took place on the 12th, Alan West was caught with his papier-mâché replica head. And at this point, the guards knew what the head was going to be used for. And Alan was about to be in a lot of trouble. And because of that, Alan was willing to give up all of the information he had to ensure that he didn't get in too much trouble for having this papier-mâché head. And fortunately, he did, because Alan is the biggest reason why we have all of the information we have about this entire escape. Without Alan essentially ratting on his friends, a lot of this prison escape would have been left to speculation. Now, if you want to get into a bit of conspiracy, since their escape, there has been alleged sightings of these escaped men, some in the United States, some in Brazil, and a letter has even surfaced supposedly being written from one of these escapees to a loved one, claiming that all of the men made it out alive, although none of these were ever confirmed. And it's very likely that all of the men that escaped Alcatraz that day either died during their escape or are dead now due to natural causes, or simply due to the consequences of living a life of crime. So yeah, when you mix a prison that is impossible to escape with prisoners that are impossible to keep confined, you get an ongoing mystery that lasts over 60 years. But as crazy as this story may be, we still have 2 more to cover. The Catch Me If You Can escapes. When you were a kid on the playground playing tag with your friends, did you ever say, "Catch me if you can," while running away? Well, Frank Abagnale said "catch me if you can" every day to the FBI for years while on the run for stealing millions of dollars and breaking a laundry list of other laws. The story of Frank Abagnale literally inspired the movie Catch Me If You Can. And today, I'm gonna tell the real story of exactly how he escaped prison both times. I did give a bit of a teaser on why he was put in jail, but let me give a bit more context. Frank Abagnale started at an early age, similar to the first story, when he moved to New York at the age of 16 by himself. He quickly realized that as a child, you can't do much, so he decided to no longer be a child. He altered his driver's license to say 26, not 16. Not only does he need to be an adult, but he needs money, and living in New York is not cheap. So what's the natural next step? Get a job, right? Earn some money? Of course not. You start defrauding banks with fraudulent checks. And that's exactly where Frank Abagnale Jr. started his infamous streak of conning and crime. Frank wasn't your average run-of-the-mill fraudster, and he was rather clever and charming. And one of the biggest reasons why he was able to get away with his crimes for so long is because he was a serial imposter, specifically by impersonating professionals when cashing these checks so that there was less scrutiny and chance of being figured out. He faked being a pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, and other white-collar professions to ensure that he was not on anybody's radar. And obviously, it worked. After collecting millions of dollars from these fraudulent checks and living a luxurious lifestyle and traveling the world on money that wasn't his, Frank was ultimately caught. Frank was initially caught in France, where he spent time in both French prisons and Swedish prisons. And after serving time in both countries and being banned from Sweden, Frank was deported back to the United States of America. And when Frank's plane landed in New York City, while it was still on the tarmac, Frank was able to escape the plane through the kitchen galley. And not only did he escape the plane through the galley, but he also escaped from the airport on foot. Keep in mind, airports are pretty secure places. And I guess this was, a different time, if you know what I mean. But still, that's a pretty crazy feat. This is the tame prison escape of the 2, which is why I'm kind of covering it a bit quickly. Frank ended up being on the run for a few weeks until he was caught once again, this time at the Montreal airport. You'd think this guy would have learned his lesson around airports, but I guess not. It's also a bit ironic that he was caught in Quebec, a French-speaking Canadian province. Regardless, it's this second capture which sparks the crazy story of his second escape from prison. Frank was sent to a federal detention center in Atlanta, Georgia, where he was awaiting his trial. And it was at this detention center where he pulled off the most lucky and almost funny prison escapes. The US Marshal that brought Frank Abagnale into this detention center somehow managed to forget Abagnale's paperwork. And this gave Abagnale a lot of room to come up with convenient stories. And the story that he began to spin was that he was a prison inspector, a secret shopper of penitentiaries, if you will. And because of this, although he was incarcerated, he was given very special treatment, specifically by the guards. One of the most interesting perks that Frank got was he actually wasn't even in a prison jumpsuit. He was allowed to wear street clothes, which may seem simple, but is a huge privilege. So even though Frank is locked up, he's not necessarily in a bad situation. Guards are speculating that because there's no papers, he must be a prison inspector. Frank is definitely not gonna tell them that's not the case. He's being given special treatment in this jail, which is almost unheard of. And he then gets the idea that, maybe I can get out of this place. And that's exactly where his escape begins. After he decided that he was going to escape, he calls his girlfriend, as he knew that he would need somebody on the outside to help validate the story he was about to tell. When he called his girlfriend, he ensured that she had an FBI business card from an agent that previously visited her due to some other things that Frank was up to, and then he asked her to impersonate a magazine writer, which she did, and she used this fake writer persona to set up a meeting with the real police inspector, who she would also get the business card of, which was the entire point of the meeting. Once Frank's girlfriend had the FBI's card and the prison inspector's card, they were well on their way to breaking Frank out. She went to a local paper copy place and made 500 copies of the FBI agent's business card, but she changed the contact number on the business card to a payphone in a mall. During her next visit, she gave Frank both of these business cards, and with these business cards in hand, Frank was able to convince prison guards that he, in fact, was a prison inspector. Frank convinced one of these guards that he had an urgent meeting with the FBI and that he needed to be released immediately, and he even urged the guard to call the FBI agent's number on the business card that he had, which he did. And when this prison guard called the FBI agent, it was really Abigail who was waiting at the mall. And Abigail played that part perfectly, claiming that Frank had extremely sensitive information that he needed to give to her immediately, and that this information was too high level for this prison guard to be made aware of. And for that reason, the FBI agent was going to come pick up Frank at once because his prison inspection had come to a close. And later that day, prison guards walked Frank directly out of the prison, allowing him to walk directly into his girlfriend's car, and Frank drove off into the sunset once again as a free man. Although this perfect escape didn't have a perfect ending. At least, not in the way that he thought, because he was caught only a month later in New York. Frank was sentenced to 12 years in prison, where he actually ended up only serving 5, as he made a deal with the FBI that he would be released early if he would help the FBI on fraud cases and teach them all of the tricks that he used to commit all of the crimes that he did. A good deal both ways around. Now, the story actually ended up having a bit of a happy ending, because Frank really did turn his life around. He was able to be a very valuable asset to the FBI. He actually met his wife while doing FBI work and had 3 sons, and one of his sons is actually now an FBI agent. And while the escape story was utter insanity, one of the most interesting facts about this entire case is the fact that after all of the crimes were committed, all of the time on the run, and all of the jail time was served, Frank was only 26 years old, which means that everything I just described happened when he was 16 to 26. This man literally lived a lifetime's worth of life in a decade, and it's no wonder that he had such a successful book and eventual movie adaptation. There's obviously a lot more to Frank's life story, but that's beyond the scope of this video. And speaking on beyond the scope of this video, let me just say this. When doing research for this video, I found so many insane stories about people escaping prison in literally insane ways. And for this video, I wanted to pick some pretty famous examples that were verifiably crazy and also somewhat well known. However, I do have a list of over 30 other examples of people who escaped prison around the world in the most insane ways. So if you guys loved this video and would like a part 2 about more obscure and more unknown prison escapes, please let me know in the comments that you would love a part 2 to this video, and I would be more than happy to make it. Maybe if this video hits 20,000 likes, I'll make a follow-up. Your guys' support truly means a lot. Now, let's get to our third crazy prison break story. The Japanese prison break. Yoshie Shiratori is likely one of the most famous escape artists from all of Japan, and he didn't have a career in magic. He unfortunately had a life of crime. Yoshie lost his father at the age of 2, and his own mother abandoned him shortly after. And as an adolescent, he worked at a tofu shop, and then later became a fisherman, catching crabs in Russia. However, after succumbing to a crippling gambling addiction, he turned to a life of crime. Throughout his crime career, Yoshie famously escaped from 4 different prisons, and I'm about to tell you about every single one of them. Yoshie was initially put behind bars in 1936 for a felony murder charge, a murder charge that is speculated to have been a false, forced confession from abusive prison guards. Regardless, Yoshie was in prison, and during this time in the early 1900s, Japanese prison was extremely harsh, and it was for that reason that people were almost left no other option than try to escape because the living conditions were simply so horrible. And Yoshie was no different. Not long after being locked up, Yoshie began studying the routines of the guards to have an understanding of their patterns so he could potentially plan an escape. And one day, while cleaning himself in the bathhouse, he found the perfect tool to escape. He took one of the metal bands off of a wash bucket in the bathhouse and brought it back to his cell, where he was able to fashion this thin, flimsy piece of metal into a makeshift lockpick. And he used this lockpick to escape. He first waited for the guards to pass by his cell, and then he put pieces of wood blood underneath a blanket on his bed to make it appear that he was in his cell. And then he began picking the lock directly on the front door of his cell, one of the most brazen escapes we've talked about so far in this video. After successfully picking the lock on his own cell, he was free from his cell, but still behind many other locked doors. And surprisingly, he was able to successfully lockpick through numerous other doors and successfully escape the prison and achieve freedom once again. But this is only his first escape of many, as 3 days after his initial escape, he was already back in police custody because he was found stealing supplies from a local hospital. Because of this escape and attempted theft, he was given another life sentence and transferred to a different prison. Originally, Yoshie was actually placed back in the original prison he escaped from, but during World War II in 1942, Yoshie was actually transferred to another prison, known as Akita Prison, where he found himself in harsher conditions. And the guards at this prison were very privy to his escape attempts, and they wanted to make sure that they made an example out of Yoshie. One of the additional punishments that Yoshie received at this new prison was extended solitary confinement. And these solitary confinement rooms were literally designed for escape artists. They had smooth copper walls, the ceiling was extremely high, and the only way in and out was the front door, besides a skylight that was at the very top of the very high ceiling, which obviously nobody could reach. Right? Well, almost anybody couldn't reach. Because on June 15th, in solitary confinement, Yoshie decided to escape once again. When I say Yoshie was a master escape artist, I mean it. And he was able to escape this unescapable room. And how he did it was he first got out of his handcuffs. Oh yeah, he was literally kept in handcuffs 24/7 in this new prison just because they wanted to make extra sure he would not escape. But obviously that didn't stop him. He escaped these handcuffs by finding a piece of wire once again in this solitary confinement. Where it came from, we don't know. But regardless, he used it to unpick his handcuffs. At this point, his hands were free, and he began to use his bare palms and feet to scale the sides of this extremely tall prison cell. Not only was Yoshie a master lockpicker, but he was also a very talented climber, and this came in handy here. And after a few attempts, he was able to make it to this skylight, which was sealed by metal bars and impossible to escape through, besides the fact that it had a wooden frame securing those metal bars. And that wooden frame was rotting due to its exposure to the elements. Now, Yoshie wasn't able to just break this wood frame in one go, but similar to the first story where the men broke through the concrete over time, Yoshie over time was able to pick away at the wooden window frame until he was able to escape through the roof of this unescapable room. Once Yoshie was certain that the wooden frame was brittle enough, he waited until a particularly stormy night to bust through the roof, as he assumed on a stormy night the guards would be less likely to suspect tapping on the ceiling to be footsteps and more likely to simply write them off as rain, which is exactly what he did. And it worked flawlessly. And once again, Yoshie was a free man. Now this time you must be asking yourself, okay, obviously he didn't steal again, right? He escaped prison twice, almost an impossible feat. There's no way he was going to steal again to go back to prison, right? And you're technically right, but obviously he did go back to jail because we still have 2 more escapes to talk about. And the reason he was sent back to prison is rather unique. After his 3 months of essentially homeless freedom, he decided to pay one of the head guards from Akita Prison a visit, because this head guard was one of the only ones who never beaten and abused him. The guard recognized Yoshie at his door and let him in and fed Yoshie and allowed him to tell his story. And Yoshie explained to the head guard that he was here simply to tell him his plan because he deserved to know, because he was the only one who treated Yoshie well. Yoshie explained how he wanted to go to America to raise awareness about the human rights violations that were taking place in Japanese prison, and hopefully through this awareness and a civil lawsuit be able to gain his freedom once again. And while this head guard seemed to be respectful and listening, when Yoshie went to use the washroom, this head guard unsurprisingly called the police and Yoshie was sent back to prison once again. Now this time, Yoshie requested that he at least go to a Tokyo prison where it's a bit warmer, because the first 2 prisons he had spent time in were in the northern part of Japan where it was relatively cold, which only added to the distress that he experienced within prison. However, this 3rd prison he was sent to was not in Tokyo and not in a warm climate at all. It was actually the northernmost prison in all of Japan, known as Abashiri Prison. And the guards at this prison were not messing around. At this point, they knew this man was extremely clever and not only escaped from 1 prison, but from 2, using different methods. And when they booked him into this 3rd prison, they made sure that he would never escape again. He was in a cell that only had openings that were smaller than the human body, so he could not possibly escape. He was given custom fit ankle cuffs and arm cuffs that were behind his back without keyholes, so they could not possibly be picked. And he was almost always by himself in freezing cold condition. And on top of this, his life sentence was only extended due to his additional escape. So realistically, at this point, Yoshie had nothing to live for. His arms and legs were bound. There was absolutely absolutely no opportunity for escape, and he was alone all of the time, freezing cold and poorly treated. But somehow, Yoshi still had one more trick up his sleeve. While confined in this hellhole, Yoshi's body was basically useless, but his mind was definitely not. And what he did to escape Abashiri prison was absolutely insane. He realized that the cell that he was being held in was made primarily of iron, and the food that he was given every single day was a very salty miso soup. And while he needed to eat as much of his food as possible to live, he always left a little bit of miso soup behind, which he would splash directly on the bolts of the observation window on the door and on the hinges of his handcuffs and ankle cuffs. And slowly, over time, the salt and oxygen exposure on this metal would slowly cause it to rust and weaken. And after 6 months of slowly deteriorating the metal that confined him, he was able to make a move. Once again, at night, he started by fully removing his leg cuffs and then his arm cuffs, and then began the true challenge. He began unbolting the observation window on the front door of his cell, but there was still one problem. Even with the observation window bars removed, the hole was still too small for the human body. Well, at least the average human body. Yoshi was, of course, a talented contortionist. Maybe because he was ultra flexible, or maybe just because he was ultra determined, he was able to dislocate his shoulders to shove his torso through this observation window and flop himself on the ground outside of his cell, almost free. He later broke through an unprotected window in the ceiling in a different part of the jail and was once again a free man, and also the first person ever to escape from Abashiri prison, one of the most brutal Japanese prisons ever. But similar to Alcatraz, the risks associated with escaping this prison weren't just within the walls. Even if you escape this prison, you are still in an extremely remote northern part of Japan with no civilization around you, extremely cold temperatures, and on top of all of this, mountain bears. But somehow, Yoshi still survived. He ended up finding an abandoned mine shaft in one of the nearby mountains and was able to live in there alone, primarily eating nuts, berries, small animals in the area, and even crab fishing, which he reported to have learned from watching the bears do it, which is insane if true. But here's the thing, Yoshi didn't die in this mine shaft. He obviously got a bit restless and decided that it was worth risking going back into civilization, and made the long trek to the nearest city, where he was surprised to see English and American soldiers and what seemed to be a huge change in the culture. And that's when he grabbed a newspaper and got caught up to date. During his 2 years spent in this abandoned mineshaft, World War II had come to a close, Japan had surrendered, and America, for the most part, had taken over the entire penitentiary system, which to Yoshi was a huge relief, because he assumed at that point that there would be huge reform, and at the very least, they'd be less on his case. And with this newfound information, he felt more confident to try to return to his family. But it was on this 50-day journey from where he was to his family that he found himself in trouble once again. Starving on his journey, he decided to pick some tomatoes from a tomato field that he was passing, and the farmer who owned this field just so happened to see Yoshi take these tomatoes. And this farmer mistook Yoshi for a local thief. The two ended up fighting, and the farmer ended up dying as a result of the fight. Some claims state that Yoshi killed this man accidentally, and others claim that it was legitimate self-defense. Regardless, the farmer was killed, and Yoshi once again was caught. But initially, they didn't even know who they had. They only thought they had a murderer, but once he was fully booked, they realized that they had the infamous escapist Yoshi Shiratori. And he was no longer sentenced to life in prison, he was sentenced to death. The year is now 1947, and Yoshi is being sent to Sapporo prison, where he will await his execution. And obviously, because Yoshi has now escaped 3 different prisons using 3 different methods and now has theft and murder under his belt, the police are taking absolutely no chances with this final cell. Yoshi is being given 24/7 surveillance, reinforced doors and bars, and any opening that leads to this room is smaller than the human head. Because no matter how good of a contortionist you are, you can't make your skull smaller. So in this situation, there is absolutely no way that Yoshi escapes, right? This is obviously where the story ends. He was obviously later executed by the Japanese government, and that's history, right? Of course not. This is Yoshi we're talking about. And interestingly, this is one of the most simple escapes he performed. Because since day 1 in this jail cell, Yoshi started playing mind games, specifically by always looking up. Yoshi, up until this point, had always escaped through the roof, and his guards knew that. And every day when the guards would check on him, Yoshi would make sure that he was looking up. And as a result, the guards were always looking up, making sure that when they would check on Yoshi, they would always check the ceiling. But this escape had nothing to do with the ceiling, and Yoshi was going in the opposite direction. Yoshi's cell was fortified on the walls, ceiling, openings, but one place that wasn't fortified was the floor. And over the course of a month, Yoshi would remove a floorboard and begin digging into the floor below his bed, in secrecy until he had a usable tunnel. And once again, one morning, the guards were unable to get a response out of Yoshi. And when they entered his cell, they realized that what was in his bed wasn't Yoshi, but once again, a pile of wood. Almost a calling card at this point. And for a year, Yoshi was on the run. And as you may or may not know, he did go back to jail one last time. But this time was different. He ended up confessing to a random police officer who decided to offer him a cigarette in public. And at this point, Yoshi could not handle the guilt, and he confessed everything to this police officer who was simply offering a gesture of kindness. But when Yoshi was tried again, things were different. The system treated him with sympathy. Reform seemed to have taken place. The murder charge he had was dropped and considered self-defense. And as a result, so was his execution. His request to go to a Tokyo prison was accepted, and his new sentence was only 20 years. 20 years which he happily served, as his prison conditions were much better. And after 14 out of those 20 years, Yoshi was paroled on good behavior, and was for the first time in a long time, a truly free man. This story is insane, and I knew I had to save it for last. And while some claim parts are exaggerated, personally, I don't even care. I think it's a great story. And for that reason, Yoshi is a bit of a legend in Japan, and there are even statues up of him, which is kind of interesting. But I suppose the story is something you can learn from. Yoshi passed away in 1979 at the age of 71, but he still lives on today in folklore, stories like this, films, books, and other stuff like that.